Hey, still fighting with sleep? That's all right. You don't need to battle your own mind tonight. Just stay here for a while. The rain's steady, the room's quiet, and I've got 5 gentle stories to keep you company until your thoughts finally loosen their grip. Story 1. The tenants who kept moving in and out quickly. I'd been living in apartment 4B for almost 3 years when I finally started keeping count. The unit next door, 4A, separated from my bedroom by a wall thin enough to hear conversations through, had seen 11 different tenants in that time. 11 people who'd moved in with boxes and furniture and hopeful expressions, and then vanished weeks or months later without so much as a goodbye. At first I thought it was just bad luck, the kind of turnover you get in a transient city where people are always chasing better jobs or cheaper rent. But after a while, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The building itself was nothing special. A 6-story brick walk-up in a neighborhood that had been up and coming for about a decade without ever quite arriving. My apartment was small but functional. 1 bedroom, a galley kitchen, windows that faced a courtyard where pigeons gathered to argue about breadcrumbs. I worked from home as a freelance translator, which meant I spent a lot of time in those rooms, listening to the ambient sounds of the building, footsteps in the hallway, music from the unit below, the occasional argument echoing up through the heating vents. I knew this building's rhythms the way you know a song you've heard 1,000 times, and I knew something was wrong with 4A. The first few turnovers, I didn't think much of it. A young guy moved in, seemed nice enough, waved at me in the hallway a few times, and then one morning his door was open and a cleaning crew was inside stripping the place down to bare walls. The super told me he'd broken his lease, moved back home to take care of a sick parent. Sad, but understandable. A month later, a couple in their 30s took over the unit. I could hear them laughing through the wall sometimes, could smell their cooking when they made something with a lot of garlic. They lasted about 6 weeks before they were gone too, their moving truck pulling away on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. No one told me where they went. After the 3rd or 4th tenant disappeared, I started asking questions. The super, a heavy-set man named Bert, who'd been running the building since before I moved in, always had an explanation. This one got transferred for work. That one's relationship fell apart. The other one just decided the commute wasn't worth it. Reasonable stories, all of them, delivered with a shrug and a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. But the more I paid attention, the more I noticed things that didn't add up. The tenants who left 4A never seemed to take everything with them. I'd see the cleaning crews hauling out furniture, clothes, boxes of personal items, things you'd expect someone to pack if they were moving to a new place. Once I saw them carrying out a framed photograph, the kind you'd hang above a mantel, and I couldn't understand why anyone would leave that behind. I asked Bert about it, and he said sometimes people just wanted a fresh start, didn't want reminders of their old life. But who leaves behind their grandmother's portrait? Who abandons their winter coat in March? I should have pushed harder, should have called someone, done some research, trusted the unease that had started to coil in my stomach every time I saw that door open and a new face moving in. But I was busy with my own life, distracted by deadlines and the low-grade loneliness of working from home. And it was easier to accept Bert's explanations than to dig into something that might turn out to be nothing. So I let it go. I smiled at the new tenants when I passed them in the hall, made small talk in the elevator, and tried not to count the weeks until they'd be gone too. Then I met Yuki, and everything changed. She moved into 4A on a cold Sunday in late January, hauling boxes up the stairs by herself while snow drifted past the windows at the end of the hall. I was coming back from a coffee run, and I offered to help without really thinking about it. Just the automatic kindness you extend to a neighbor struggling with a heavy load. She accepted with a grateful smile, and over the next hour we carried her life up 4 flights of stairs, making conversation between trips about where she'd moved from, what she did for work, how she'd found this place. Yuki was a few years younger than me, maybe 25 or 26, with dark hair she kept in a messy bun and a laugh that made you want to laugh too. She worked remotely for a tech company, coding something I didn't understand but pretended to find interesting. She'd moved to the city for a relationship that had ended badly, and she was looking for a fresh start in a new place where no one knew her name. I told her about the good takeout places nearby, warned her about the hot water situation in the mornings, gave her my number in case she ever needed anything. By the time we finished unpacking her living room, it felt like we'd known each other for years. Over the next few weeks, Yuki and I fell into an easy friendship. We'd grab dinner together once or twice a week, binge-watch terrible reality shows on her couch, text each other random observations throughout the day. She was the first real friend I'd made in the building, the first person who made me feel like I was part of a community rather than just a tenant paying rent. I started looking forward to hearing her footsteps in the hall, the muffled sound of her music through the wall, all the little signs that someone was living next door. I didn't tell her about the pattern, didn't mention that 11 people had lived in her apartment before her, or that none of them had stayed longer than 3 months. I told myself it didn't matter, that Yuki was different, that whatever had driven the others away wouldn't touch her. But late at night, lying in bed, listening to the silence on the other side of the wall, I couldn't stop the small, cold voice in my head that whispered, "How long until she disappears too?" 7 weeks after she moved in, I got my answer. I hadn't seen Yuki in 3 days. No response to my texts. No answer when I knocked on her door. No footsteps or music, or any of the sounds I'd grown used to hearing through the wall. I told myself she was probably just busy, maybe visiting family or on a work trip she'd forgotten to mention. But on the 4th day, I came home from the grocery store and saw Bert unlocking her door with a cleaning crew waiting behind him. "She moved out," he said when I asked, not quite meeting my eyes. "Decided the place wasn't for her. Happens sometimes." I stood there in the hallway, my grocery bags growing heavy in my hands, and I knew he was lying. Yuki wouldn't leave without saying goodbye. Yuki wouldn't leave without taking her grandmother's recipe book, the one she'd shown me the first week she moved in, the one that had been in her family for 4 generations. Something had happened to her, something that Bert knew about, and I was done pretending not to notice. I started with the obvious approach, trying to reach Yuki through every channel I could think of. I called her phone and got voicemail, left messages that grew increasingly desperate as the days passed. I found her on social media, but her accounts had gone silent the same day I'd last heard from her. No posts, no activity, no evidence that she was still out there living her life somewhere else. I even tracked down her employer's website and called their main line, pretending to be a friend trying to reconnect. But the receptionist said she couldn't give out information about current or former employees. The word former made my stomach drop, though I couldn't be sure what it meant. After a week of dead ends, I started looking into the building itself. I'd lived here for 3 years without ever really thinking about its history, content to pay my rent and mind my own business. Now I spent hours at my laptop, searching public records and news archives for anything connected to this address. What I found made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The building had been constructed in 1952 and had changed hands several times over the decades, nothing unusual for a property this old. But starting about 6 years ago, around the time the current management company took over, there had been a string of missing persons reports filed by family members of people who'd lived here. 5 reports in total, all for residents of 4A, all dismissed by police as adults who'd simply chosen to move on without telling anyone. The families had pushed back, insisted their loved ones would never just vanish, but without evidence of foul play, there was nothing the authorities could do. The cases went cold, one after another, and eventually the families stopped calling. I printed out everything I could find, the police reports, the news articles, the property records, showing when each tenant had signed their lease and when they'd allegedly broken it. Spread across my kitchen table, the documents painted a picture I couldn't ignore anymore. Apartment 4. A wasn't just unlucky. It was a trap, and Yuki had walked right into it, and so had 11 other people before her. I needed to get inside that apartment. Bert had already handed the keys over to the cleaning crew, but I knew from experience that they never worked past 6. If I waited until evening, the unit would be empty, cleaned out, ready for the next victim, but maybe still holding some clue about what had happened to Yuki. The lock on 4A was the same model as mine, a basic pin tumbler that I'd learned to pick 2 years ago after locking myself out one too many times. It wasn't legal, what I was planning, but I was past caring about legal. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to find them by following the rules. I waited until just after 9, when the hallway had been quiet for hours, and most of my neighbors had settled in for the night. The lock gave way after about 30 seconds of fumbling, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the pick twice. The door swung open onto darkness, and I stepped inside with my phone flashlight cutting a pale beam through the shadows. The apartment had been stripped bare, just like I'd seen happen so many times before. No furniture, no personal items, no sign that anyone had ever lived here. The walls were freshly painted, that generic off-white landlords use to cover up any trace of the previous tenant, and the carpet still had the parallel lines of a recent vacuuming. It smelled like cleaning chemicals and something underneath them, something faintly sweet and organic that I couldn't identify. I moved through the rooms slowly, checking the closets and cabinets, running my hands along the walls looking for anything out of place. The layout was a mirror image of my own apartment, bedroom on the left, bathroom straight ahead, kitchen tucked into the corner by the windows. Everything was empty, everything was clean, and I was starting to think I'd risked a breaking and entering charge for nothing when I noticed the seam in the bedroom closet. It was almost invisible, just a thin line running vertically along the back wall where the paint hadn't quite covered a crack in the drywall. I pressed my palm against it and felt the wall give slightly, flexing inward like there was empty space behind it. My heart started pounding as I traced the seam upward and found a small latch hidden at the top, painted over but still functional. I flipped it, and the back wall of the closet swung open on silent hinges. Behind it was a narrow passage, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, leading into darkness. The smell was stronger here, that sweet, organic scent mixed with something mustier, like old fabric left in a damp space too long. I shone my flashlight into the passage and saw that it extended about 10 feet before opening into a larger space I couldn't quite make out. There were marks on the floor, scuff marks and scratches, as if something heavy had been dragged through here repeatedly. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave, to call the police, to get as far from this building as possible, but I thought about Yuki's smile, her laugh, the way she'd trusted me to tell her if anything about this place was wrong. I thought about all the others who'd lived in this apartment and vanished without a trace, all the families who'd never gotten answers, all the years this had been happening while I lived right next door and did nothing. I couldn't walk away now. I had to know. I squeezed into the passage and started walking toward the darkness ahead. The space at the end was larger than I expected, some kind of room that had been carved out between the walls, hidden from the official floor plan, invisible to anyone who didn't know to look for it. My flashlight swept across the interior, and what I saw made me clamp my hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. There were photographs covering every surface. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, tacked to the walls and spread across makeshift tables and piled in boxes on the floor. Every photo was of someone I recognized, tenants from 4A, captured in moments they thought were private. Sleeping, showering, getting dressed, living their lives without any idea that someone was watching through holes I could now see drilled at various heights along the walls. I found Yuki in at least a dozen shots, her face frozen in expressions ranging from thoughtful concentration to unguarded laughter, and I felt bile rise in my throat. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the shrine in the corner. It was arranged like an altar, candles and trinkets surrounding a collection of personal items I recognized from the tenants who'd lived here. A leather wallet, a silver necklace, a pair of glasses with distinctive red frames, and at the center, displayed like a trophy, was Yuki's grandmother's recipe book, the one she'd told me had been in her family for 4 generations, the one she would never, ever leave behind voluntarily. I took out my phone to call the police, my hands trembling so violently I could barely unlock the screen. That's when I heard the sound behind me, a soft creak, like weight settling on an old floorboard. And I realized I wasn't alone in the dark. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting wild arcs through the shadows, and found myself face to face with Bert. He was standing in the entrance to the passage, his bulk filling the narrow opening, his expression somewhere between disappointment and resignation. In one hand, he held a length of rope, coiled neatly like he'd been waiting for an opportunity to use it. In the other was a small knife, the kind you'd use for opening boxes, nothing dramatic but sharp enough to do damage. "I really wish you hadn't come in here," he said, and his voice was calm, almost sad. 3 years you've been living next door, and you never caused any problems, never asked too many questions. I thought maybe you were different. I backed up until I hit the shrine behind me, knocking over one of the candles and sending Yuki's recipe book tumbling to the floor. My phone was still in my hand, the screen now locked, completely useless. I tried to think, tried to figure out some way past him, but the passage was the only exit and he was blocking it completely. There was nowhere to go. "Where's Yuki?" The words came out steadier than I expected, fueled by something that might have been anger or might have been the last desperate surge of adrenaline before everything fell apart. "What did you do to her?" Bert sighed, like I'd asked him about an unpleasant chore he'd been putting off. "She's gone. They're all gone. That's the point." He gestured vaguely at the photographs surrounding us, the shrine, the accumulated trophies of his obsession. They come in, they live their little lives. They never notice how thin the walls are or how easy it is to watch. And then, when I've learned everything about them, when I know them better than they know themselves, he shrugged. They move on. Move on where? My voice cracked on the last word because I already knew the answer. I'd known it since I saw those missing persons reports, since I realized that families had been looking for their loved ones for years without ever finding them. "Bert, where do they go?" He smiled then, and it was the same half-smile he'd always given me in the hallway, the same pleasant expression he wore when he collected rent or fixed a leaky faucet. But there was nothing behind it now. No warmth, no humanity, just a void wearing a human face. "Down," he said simply. "There's a sub-basement below the one the building officially has. It's been here since the 50s. Some kind of bomb shelter the original owners built and then forgot about. It's very quiet down there, very private." His smile widened. "They don't bother anyone anymore." I felt my legs give way, and I slid down against the wall until I was sitting on the floor surrounded by photographs of dead women. Because that's what they were. All of them, every tenant who'd lived in 4A and vanished without a trace. Not missing, not moved away. Dead, buried in some forgotten hole beneath the building where I'd slept peacefully for 3 years. "Why?" I managed to ask, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. "Why do you do this?" Bert considered the question like it was genuinely interesting, tilting his head slightly to one side. "Because I can," he said finally. "Because no one notices. Because they're all so lonely, so desperate for connection, that they never think to be afraid of the person who holds the keys." He took a step closer, the knife glinting in the beam of my fallen flashlight. "You were different, you know. I thought about you for a long time, but you never seemed quite right for 4A. Too observant, too careful. I always figured you'd be more trouble than you were worth. Another step. Turns out I was right." I scrambled backward, my hands scraping against photographs and candle wax on the rough concrete floor. My phone had slid somewhere out of reach, lost in the darkness, and the only light came from my flashlight lying on its side, casting long, distorted shadows across Bert's approaching form. I thought about screaming, but we were deep inside the walls of a building with thick old brick and insulation designed to muffle sound. No one would hear me. No one had heard any of the others. Then my hand closed around something cold and heavy, one of the candlesticks from the shrine, solid brass, weighty enough to do real damage. I didn't think, I just swung. The candlestick connected with Bert's knee with a crack that echoed through the small space. He howled and staggered sideways, dropping the rope and grabbing at the wall for support. I was on my feet before he could recover, shoving past him into the passage, my shoulder slamming against his chest hard enough to knock him off balance. He grabbed at my shirt as I pushed by, his fingers catching the fabric and tearing it, but I was already moving, already running, already halfway to the closet door that led back to the empty apartment. I burst out into 4A and sprinted for the front door, not looking back, not thinking about anything except getting out. The hallway was dark and empty, and I ran for the stairwell because the elevator would take too long, would trap me in a metal box where he could catch up. I took the stairs 2 at a time, 4 flights down in what felt like seconds, and exploded out onto the street into the cold February night. There were people on the sidewalk, a couple walking their dog, a man smoking outside the bodega on the corner, and I ran toward them screaming for help, screaming to call the police, screaming that there was a killer in my building and people buried in the basement. They stared at me like I was insane, this wild-eyed woman with a torn shirt and mascara running down her face. But someone must have believed me because I heard sirens in the distance growing closer, and I collapsed onto the pavement and let myself fall apart. The police found Bert in the hidden room, trying to destroy the photographs in the shrine. He'd barricaded himself inside, but it didn't take long for them to break through, and when they did, he didn't resist. Just sat there among his trophies with that same calm expression, like he'd always known this day would come and had made his peace with it. They found the sub-basement too. I wasn't there when they opened it, but the detective who interviewed me later described what they discovered in careful, clinical terms designed to minimize the trauma. 7 bodies in various states of decomposition, buried in shallow graves dug into the dirt floor. Rebecca Thornton and Maria Santos were among them, the 2 women from the missing persons reports I'd found. And Yuki was there too, her body recovered from a grave that looked freshly dug, placed there less than a week ago. She'd been dead almost as long as she'd been missing. I'd been texting a ghost, knocking on the door of an empty apartment, while she lay in the dark beneath my feet. The investigation that followed turned my building into a crime scene for nearly 3 weeks. Yellow tape across the entrances, forensic teams in white suits moving in and out at all hours, news vans parked along the curb with reporters doing stand-ups against the backdrop of a place I used to call home. I couldn't go back inside, couldn't have made myself cross that threshold, even if the police had allowed it. So I stayed with a coworker I barely knew, sleeping on her spare bed and watching the coverage unfold on television like it was happening to someone else. Bert's full name was Burton Ray Holloway, and he'd been the building superintendent for almost 8 years. Before that, he'd worked maintenance at a residential facility upstate that had closed down amid allegations of patient mistreatment. Before that, the records got spotty. A few arrests for minor offenses, a psychiatric evaluation that had been sealed by court order, stretches of time where he seemed to disappear entirely from any official documentation. The detectives told me they were still piecing together his history, but what they'd found so far painted a picture of a man who'd been practicing for this his entire life. The 7 bodies in the sub-basement weren't his only victims. As the investigation expanded, police discovered that Bert had worked at 3 other buildings in different cities over the past 2 decades. Always as a superintendent, always with access to master keys and maintenance schedules and the private lives of everyone who lived under his care. They found similar hidden spaces in 2 of those buildings, not as elaborate as the room behind 4A, but with the same disturbing evidence of surveillance and obsession. The body count kept climbing as more jurisdictions got involved, and by the end of the first month, the official number stood at 14 confirmed victims spanning almost 20 years. 14 women who'd made the mistake of renting an apartment in a building where Bert held the keys. 14 families who'd spent years wondering what happened to daughters, sisters, mothers, friends. 14 lives erased because one man wanted to watch, to possess, to own something so completely that he couldn't let it exist apart from him. The prosecutors called him a collector, which seemed like too gentle a word for what he'd done, but I understood what they meant. To Bert, those women weren't people. They were things to be acquired and cataloged and eventually stored away where no one else could touch them. I had to give a statement, then another, then sit for hours with detectives who wanted to know everything I'd observed over 3 years of living next door to a killing ground. I told them about the turnover, the belongings left behind, the explanations Bert had always offered that I'd been too willing to accept. I told them about Yuki, how we'd become friends, how I'd helped her move in, how I'd noticed her absence too late to do anything that mattered. They recorded everything and thanked me for my cooperation and never once said what I knew they were thinking, that I should have seen it sooner, that if I'd paid more attention, Yuki and maybe others might still be alive. I thought it too. I still think it, in the quiet hours when I can't sleep and my mind runs through all the moments I might have intervened. The cabinets Yuki mentioned being open when she came home, the sounds she said she heard through the walls at night, which she'd laughed off as old building noises. The time she'd told me she felt like someone was watching her, and I'd said it was probably just new apartment paranoia. I could have warned her then, could have told her about the pattern I'd noticed, could have done something other than smile and change the subject because I didn't want to seem crazy. But I didn't. And now she was dead, and nothing I did would change that. The family started reaching out about 6 weeks after the arrest, once my name became public as the woman who'd discovered the hidden room. Most of them just wanted to talk, to hear about their loved ones' final weeks from someone who'd lived nearby, to fill in the gaps that the police reports left empty. I spoke with Yuki's mother for almost 2 hours, describing her daughter's laugh and her terrible taste in reality television and the way she'd made the best of a bad situation after her relationship fell apart. Her mother cried through most of it, and so did I. And when she thanked me at the end, I wanted to tell her she had nothing to thank me for. I hadn't saved her daughter. I hadn't even tried until it was far too late. Rebecca Thornton's sister called me too, along with Maria Santos's brother and the families of 3 other victims whose names I'd only learned from the news. They all wanted the same thing: connection, understanding, some way to make sense of something that would never make sense. I gave them what I could, which wasn't much, and I added their grief to the weight I was already carrying. The trial was scheduled for the following spring, and the prosecutor's office warned me that I'd likely be called as a witness. They were building a case that would put Bert away for multiple consecutive life sentences, and my testimony about discovering the hidden room was a key piece of evidence. I told them I'd do whatever they needed, but the thought of sitting in a courtroom with Bert, of looking at his face while I described what I'd found behind that closet wall, made me feel like I was drowning in cold water. My therapist, I'd started seeing one twice a week after the first month, said it was normal to feel overwhelmed. She said I was processing a trauma that most people never experience, that the guilt I felt about Yuki was a common response even though it wasn't rational, that healing would take time and wouldn't follow a straight line. I nodded and agreed, and did the exercises she suggested. But I couldn't shake the feeling that some part of me had been left behind in that hidden room, buried alongside all those photographs and trophies and the recipe book that Yuki would never use again. I couldn't go back to my apartment. The building had been cleared for habitation again after the forensic teams finished their work, but even the thought of walking through that lobby made me nauseous. My co-worker helped me hire movers to pack up my things, and I watched from across the street as they carried boxes out to a truck. 3 years of my life reduced to a pile of cardboard and furniture that suddenly seemed meaningless. I'd been so proud of that apartment when I'd first moved in, so certain that I was building a life for myself in this new city. Now, all I could think about was the wall I'd shared with 4A, the thin barrier between my bedroom and the horrors that had unfolded just inches away. The movers brought everything to a storage unit on the other side of town. I wasn't ready to look at any of it yet. Wasn't ready to decide what to keep and what to throw away. I just needed it out of that building, away from the memories, somewhere I didn't have to think about it until I was strong enough to face it again, if that day ever came. The trial began on a rainy Monday in April, almost 14 months after I'd found the hidden room behind Yuki's closet. I sat in the witness box for 2 days, answering questions from prosecutors and defense attorneys, describing everything from the first time I'd noticed the tenant turnover to the moment I'd swung that candlestick at Bert's knee. I kept my eyes on the lawyers, on the jury, on the wood grain of the railing in front of me. Anywhere except the defense table where Bert sat in a suit that didn't fit him right, watching me with that same placid expression he'd always worn. His attorney tried to paint me as an unreliable witness, someone who'd broken into an apartment illegally and contaminated a crime scene before police could properly investigate. She suggested that my friendship with Yuki had clouded my judgment, that I'd constructed a narrative to explain a disappearance that might have had a much more mundane explanation. I answered her questions as calmly as I could, and I didn't let her see how badly her implications stung. The evidence spoke for itself. The bodies, the photographs, the journals Bert had kept detailing his observations of every woman who'd lived in 4A. No amount of legal maneuvering could explain that away. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. 14 counts of first-degree murder, plus stalking, kidnapping, abuse of a corpse, and a list of other charges that took the clerk nearly 5 minutes to read aloud. Bert stood motionless as the verdicts were announced, his face betraying nothing, like he was listening to a weather report about a city he'd never visit. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, he turned and looked directly at me for the first time since the trial began. "I took good care of them," he said, and his voice was the same calm, reasonable tone I'd heard 100 times in the hallway of our building. Better than anyone else ever would have. They were mine, and I kept them safe. The judge cut him off before he could continue, but those words followed me out of the courtroom and into the parking lot and all the way back to the small apartment I'd rented on the other side of the city. They're still with me now, months later, every time I close my eyes and try to sleep. He got 14 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The judge called him a predator who exploited the trust and vulnerability of his victims and recommended that he never be considered for release under any circumstances. The families in the gallery cried and held each other, and I sat in the back row feeling nothing at all, just a hollow space where emotions were supposed to be. Justice had been served, whatever that meant. It didn't bring Yuki back. It didn't erase the 3 years I'd spent living next to a graveyard without knowing it. I moved twice in the year after the trial, never staying anywhere longer than a few months, never able to shake the feeling that the walls were watching me. I couldn't live in apartment buildings anymore, couldn't handle the shared walls, the communal hallways, the superintendents with their master keys and their access to every corner of a tenant's life. I found a small house on the outskirts of a different city entirely, a single-story cottage with no basement and no attic and walls I could see straight through to the exterior siding. It cost more than I could comfortably afford, but the peace of mind was worth the financial strain. I still work from home, translating documents in languages that feel safer than English because they don't carry the weight of memory. My clients don't know anything about my past, and I prefer it that way. I'm just a name on an invoice to them, a reliable contractor who delivers quality work on time. The anonymity feels like protection, like a layer of insulation between who I am now and who I was when I lived in apartment 4B and thought I understood how the world worked. The guilt has faded, mostly. My therapist helped me understand that I couldn't have known what Bert was doing, that the signs I'd noticed were ambiguous enough that any reasonable person might have missed them. She reminded me that I was the one who'd finally uncovered the truth, who'd risked my life to find evidence that led to justice for 14 families. I try to hold on to that when the darker thoughts creep in, when I lie awake at night replaying conversations with Yuki and wondering if I could have said something different, done something different, been someone different enough to save her. I think about her more than I probably should. I think about her laugh, her terrible reality shows, the way she'd text me memes at 2 a.m. when neither of us could sleep. I think about the life she might have lived if she'd chosen a different apartment in a different building with a different superintendent. She'd be 30 now, maybe promoted at her tech job, maybe dating someone new, maybe just existing in that quiet, unremarkable way that most of us take for granted until it's gone. Instead, she's a name on a headstone in a cemetery I visit twice a year, a photograph on her mother's mantle, a memory that grows a little fainter every day, no matter how hard I try to hold on to it. The building where it all happened was sold to a development company last fall. They're tearing it down, converting the lot into luxury condos that will cost 10 times what I ever paid in rent. I drove past once, a few months ago, and watched the demolition crew taking apart the brickwork piece by piece. Somewhere in that rubble was the hidden room, the shrine, the passage between the walls where Bert had crawled to watch his victims sleep. Somewhere beneath the foundation was the sub-basement where he'd buried them, now just dirt and debris waiting to be paved over and forgotten. I don't know if that feels like closure or erasure. Maybe it's both. I don't trust easily anymore. I don't make friends with neighbors. Don't chat with maintenance workers. Don't let anyone into my life who might have reasons to watch me that I can't anticipate. It's a lonely way to exist, and my therapist says I should work on opening up again, on remembering that most people are exactly what they appear to be. But Bert appeared to be a friendly superintendent who remembered everyone's name and fixed things promptly when they broke. Bert appeared to be harmless, forgettable, part of the background noise of daily life. And behind that appearance, he was hollowing out a space between the walls where he could keep the women he'd decided belonged to him. So I check the closets in every new place I stay. I knock on walls and listen for hollow spaces. I research building histories and superintendent backgrounds before I sign any lease. These aren't the habits of someone who's healed, I know that. But they're the habits of someone who's survived, and maybe that's the best I can hope for right now. Yuki's mother sent me a card last Christmas with a photograph of her daughter tucked inside. It's sitting on my desk as I write this, propped against my monitor where I can see it every day. In the picture, Yuki is laughing at something outside the frame, her hair loose around her shoulders instead of in its usual messy bun, her eyes bright with a joy I remember but will never see again. I keep it there to remind myself why the vigilance matters, why I can't let my guard down, can't assume the best about people, can't trust that the walls around me are just walls and nothing more, because sometimes they're not. Sometimes there's someone watching from the spaces in between, waiting for you to stop paying attention. And by the time you notice, it's already too late. Story 2. My backup camera showed someone behind me. The first time I saw him, I almost didn't register what I was looking at. It was just after midnight on a Wednesday, and I was leaving work the way I always did, exhausted, smelling like garlic and grease, wanting nothing more than to get home and collapse into bed. The restaurant parking lot was nearly empty by then, just my car and a few others belonging to the closing crew, and I'd reversed out of that same spot maybe 300 times without ever thinking twice about it. But that night, when I shifted into reverse and the backup camera flickered to life on my dashboard screen, there was a face staring back at me from about 6 feet behind my bumper. I slammed on the brakes so hard my seatbelt locked. The face was pale, indistinct in the greenish glow of the camera's night vision, but unmistakably human. Someone crouched low behind my car, looking directly into the lens like they knew exactly where it was. For maybe 2 seconds, we stared at each other through that little screen, me frozen with my foot on the brake and them motionless in the dark. Then they stood up and walked away, disappearing around the corner of the building before I could even process what had happened. I sat there for a long time, my heart hammering against my ribs, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. A trick of the light, a shadow that looked like a person, some weird glitch in the camera software that had superimposed an image from somewhere else. But I knew what I'd seen. Someone had been crouching behind my car in an empty parking lot at midnight, and they'd only moved when they realized I could see them. I should probably explain that I'd only had the backup camera for about 2 months at that point. My old car, a rusted-out sedan I'd driven since college, had finally given up the ghost, and I'd replaced it with a used SUV that was newer than anything I'd ever owned. The backup camera had seemed like a luxury at first, something I'd never needed before, and probably didn't need now, but I'd gotten used to it quickly. It was useful for parallel parking, for checking blind spots, for all the little maneuvers that were easier when you could actually see what was behind you. I'd never considered that it might show me something I didn't want to see. I work as a sous chef at a steakhouse downtown, which means my schedule is the opposite of most people's. I go in around 3 in the afternoon and leave somewhere between midnight and 1 in the morning, depending on how busy we are and how long cleanup takes. The restaurant is in a decent area, business district, plenty of foot traffic during the day. But by the time I'm walking to my car, the streets are mostly empty. Just me and the occasional security guard making rounds, the distant sound of traffic on the highway, the particular silence of a city that's gone to sleep. I'd never felt unsafe before. I'd never had a reason to. After that first night, I started paying more attention to my surroundings. I'd scan the parking lot before I left the building, check between the cars, look for anything out of place. For about a week, nothing happened. Just empty asphalt and my own paranoid imagination, and I started to relax. Started to think that whoever I'd seen had just been a homeless person looking for a place to sleep, or a drunk who'd wandered into the wrong lot, or any of the harmless explanations that seemed more likely than anything sinister. I almost convinced myself it didn't matter. Then I saw him again. Same spot, same time, same crouching position behind my car. I'd walked out with two of my coworkers that night, talking about some drama with the new line cook, and I hadn't even looked at the backup camera until I was already in reverse. The screen lit up, and there he was, pale face, dark clothes, staring at the camera with an expression I couldn't read. I hit the brakes and honked my horn, and my coworkers turned to look. But by the time their eyes found the space behind my car, he was gone. Vanished into the shadows at the edge of the lot like he'd never been there at all. "What's wrong?" Luis asked, coming around to my window. "You look like you saw a ghost." I almost told him, almost described what I'd seen, asked him to walk the perimeter with me, made sure someone else knew what was happening. But standing there in the yellow glow of the parking lot lights, with Luis looking at me like I might be losing my mind, I couldn't make the words come out. What was I going to say? That someone was crouching behind my car for no apparent reason? That they'd done it twice now? It sounded crazy, even in my own head. So I just shook my head and said I'd thought I saw a cat. And Luis laughed and went back to his car, and I drove home with my hands shaking on the wheel and my eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, running through explanations that got more and more elaborate the longer I thought about them. Maybe it was the same homeless person, someone who'd found a sheltered spot near the dumpsters and kept returning to it. Maybe it was a teenager playing some kind of prank, testing how close he could get to cars without being noticed. Maybe it was pure coincidence, two different people on two different nights, both of whom happened to be behind my specific car at the specific moment I was leaving. None of these theories made me feel better. None of them explained the way he'd looked at the camera, that direct, unblinking stare that suggested he knew exactly what he was doing. The third time it happened, I was ready for him. I'd started checking the backup camera before I even shifted into reverse, watching the screen while the car was still in park, giving myself time to react if anything was there. It was a Friday night, almost 1 a.m, and I was one of the last people to leave after a brutal dinner rush. I got into my car, locked the doors, and turned on the engine. The backup camera activated automatically, showing the empty space behind my SUV, the painted lines of the parking spot, the brick wall of the building about 20 feet back. Empty. Nothing there. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding and reached for the gear shift. That's when he stepped into frame. He came from the left side of the screen, walking slowly, deliberately, until he was centered directly behind my car. Then he stopped and crouched down, just like before, and looked up at the camera. This time I could see him more clearly. A man, maybe late 30s or early 40s, with a gaunt face and hair that might have been brown or might have been just dirty. He was wearing a dark jacket and jeans, nothing distinctive, the kind of clothes that would let him blend into any crowd. And he was smiling. Not a friendly smile, not a crazy smile, just a small curving of the lips that said he knew I was watching, knew I was afraid, and wanted me to know that he knew. I laid on the horn without thinking, a long blaring sound that echoed off the buildings and made the security lights flicker. The man didn't flinch. He just kept smiling at the camera for another few seconds, then stood up slowly, almost leisurely, and walked out of frame the same way he'd come. I didn't wait to see where he went. I threw the car into drive and peeled out of that parking lot so fast my tires squealed on the pavement, and I didn't stop checking my mirrors until I was on the highway with 3 lanes of empty road between me and wherever he'd disappeared to. That night, I filed a police report. The officer who took my statement was polite but clearly skeptical, asking questions about whether I'd gotten a good look at the man, whether I could identify him, whether I had any idea who he might be or what he might want. I answered as best I could, but even I knew how thin my story sounded. Someone crouching behind my car in a parking lot, looking at my backup camera. It wasn't illegal technically, it wasn't even threatening in any way I could articulate. The officer said he'd make a note of it, suggested I vary my schedule if possible, and told me to call back if anything else happened. Something else was going to happen. I could feel it in my bones. I just didn't know yet how bad it was going to get. I tried to take the officer's advice about varying my schedule, but the restaurant business doesn't really work that way. We open when we open and close when we close, and unless I wanted to quit my job entirely, I was going to keep leaving that parking lot around midnight 5 nights a week. What I could control was how I left, making sure I walked out with other people, parking under the brightest lights I could find, checking and rechecking the backup camera before I even thought about shifting into reverse. For a while, it seemed to help. Almost 2 weeks went by without any sign of the man, and I started to hope that the police report had scared him off somehow, that he'd moved on to easier targets, or gotten bored, or simply decided I wasn't worth the effort. Then he showed up at the grocery store. It was a Sunday afternoon, my one day off, and I'd driven to the big chain store about 15 minutes from my apartment to stock up on supplies for the week. The lot was crowded with families and couples and all the normal chaos of weekend shopping, and I hadn't thought twice about where I parked or who might be watching. I loaded my bags into the back, climbed into the driver's seat, and glanced at the backup camera out of habit as I started the engine. He was there. Same crouching position, same pale face, same small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Broad daylight, surrounded by hundreds of people, and he'd still found me. He'd still positioned himself exactly where he knew I'd see him, like this was a game we were playing, and he wanted to make sure I understood the rules. I didn't hesitate this time. I threw open my door and jumped out, ready to confront him, ready to scream for help, ready to do something other than sit there frozen while he smiled at me through a camera lens. But by the time I rounded the back of my car, he was already gone. Just an empty parking space and an elderly woman loading groceries into her trunk 2 spots over, looking at me like I'd lost my mind. "Did you see him?" I asked her, my voice coming out too loud, too desperate. "The man who was just here, behind my car?" She shook her head slowly, clutching her purse a little tighter against her chest. "I didn't see anyone, honey. Are you okay?" I wasn't okay. I was about as far from okay as I'd ever been in my life. I got back in my car and drove home with my hands locked on the wheel, checking my mirrors every few seconds, watching for any sign of a dark jacket or a gaunt face in the traffic behind me. I didn't see him, but I knew he was out there somewhere, tracking my movements, learning my patterns, waiting for whatever came next. That night, I went through my apartment with fresh eyes, checking the windows and doors, looking for any sign that someone had been inside while I was gone. Everything seemed normal. Deadbolt secure, windows latched, no obvious signs of tampering, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something. The grocery store was 15 minutes from my apartment and nowhere near the restaurant. The only way he could have known I'd be there was if he'd followed me from home, which meant he knew where I lived. He'd probably known for a while. I started researching. Spent hours on my laptop looking up stalking cases, trying to understand who did this kind of thing and why. The profiles were all over the place. Ex-partners, obsessive strangers, mentally ill individuals who fixated on random targets for reasons no one could explain. Some stalkers wanted relationships, real or imagined. Others wanted control, the thrill of making someone afraid. A few just wanted to watch, to feel powerful, to exist in someone else's life without their knowledge or consent. None of the categories seemed to fit the man behind my car, but that didn't make me feel any better. It just meant I didn't know what I was dealing with. I filed another police report, this time with more urgency in my voice. The same officer took my statement and promised to increase patrols in the area, but I could tell he was starting to think I was paranoid, that I was seeing threats where none existed. He asked if I'd considered that it might be different people on different days, maybe someone waiting for a friend or looking for a lost pet. I wanted to grab him by the shoulders and shake him, make him understand that the man had smiled at me, that it was the same face every time, that no one crouches behind a stranger's car in broad daylight for innocent reasons. But I just nodded and thanked him for his time and drove home feeling more alone than ever. My co-workers started noticing that something was wrong. Luis asked me 3 times in one shift if I was feeling okay, and even the head chef, a gruff man who rarely said anything that wasn't about food, pulled me aside to ask if I needed a few days off. I told them I was fine, just stressed about some personal stuff, and they let it go, because that's what co-workers do. But I caught them exchanging glances when they thought I wasn't looking, and I knew I was becoming that person, the one who seemed a little off, a little paranoid, a little too close to the edge. The breaking point came on a Thursday night, about 3 weeks after the grocery store incident. I'd been extra careful leaving work, waiting until Luis was ready to walk out with me, keeping my keys in my hand with the panic button ready. The parking lot was empty except for our 2 cars, and I did my usual ritual, check the camera while still in park, scan the space behind me, confirm that nothing was there, empty, safe. I shifted into reverse and started backing out. That's when I saw him in the back seat, not behind the car, inside it. My backup camera showed the parking lot, showed Luis getting into his car 2 spaces over, showed everything exactly as it should be. But my rear-view mirror showed a face in the shadows of my back seat, those same pale features and that same small smile, inches away from the back of my head. He'd gotten into my car somehow, had been sitting there the whole time I did my safety checks, waiting for me to relax enough to stop looking over my shoulder. I don't remember screaming, but Luis told me later that he heard me from inside his car with the windows up. I threw open my door and fell out onto the pavement, scrambling away on my hands and knees, unable to form words or thoughts or anything beyond the primal need to get away. Luis came running, asking what was wrong, what happened, was I hurt, and when we both looked back at my car, the back seat was empty, door still locked, no sign that anyone had ever been inside. There was someone in my car, I kept saying, over and over, my voice shaking so badly the words barely came out coherent. He was in the back seat, he was right there, he was looking at me. Luis searched the entire car while I stood there shaking, opening every door, checking the trunk, looking under the seats. Nothing, no one. Just my gym bag and a jacket I'd left back there 3 days ago and the lingering smell of my own fear. Maybe you just thought you saw something, Luis said carefully, and I could hear what he wasn't saying underneath the words. Maybe you're losing it. Maybe the stress is getting to you. Maybe you need help that I can't give you. I almost believed him. Standing there in the parking lot with my heart pounding and my hands scraped from the asphalt, I almost let myself think that I'd imagined it, that my mind was playing tricks on me, that the man behind my car had never been real at all. It would have been easier to believe that. It would have been so much easier. Then I found the note tucked into my sun visor when I finally got back in the car to drive home. Just 4 words, written in neat block letters on a torn piece of paper. I like watching you. The note changed everything. I took it to the police station the next morning, sealed in a plastic bag like I'd seen on crime shows. And this time the officer who'd been humoring me finally looked concerned. He photographed it, bagged it properly for evidence, and asked me a series of questions that felt more urgent than anything he'd asked before. Did I have any enemies? Had I recently broken up with anyone? Was there anyone in my life, coworker, neighbor, old friend, who'd shown unusual interest in my movements? I answered no to everything, and his concern deepened into something that looked almost like frustration. Stalkers were easier to catch when you knew who they were. Anonymous obsession was a different beast entirely. They dusted my car for fingerprints and found nothing useful, just my own prints and a few partials that could have belonged to anyone who touched the vehicle in the past 6 months. The note yielded similarly disappointing results. Generic paper, common ink, no identifying marks. Whoever this man was, he was careful. He knew how to get close without leaving traces, how to exist in my life without giving me anything I could use against him. The detective assigned to my case, a tired-looking woman named Reyes, who'd apparently handled stalking cases before, told me this level of caution usually indicated someone with experience, someone who'd done this before and learned from past mistakes. "That's not reassuring," I told her, and she gave me a look that said she hadn't meant it to be. I couldn't keep living the way I had been, waiting for him to show up in my backup camera or my back seat or wherever he decided to appear next. Detective Reyes helped me develop what she called a safety plan. Vary my routes home, install a dash cam that recorded continuously, never leave work alone, check my car thoroughly before getting in. I followed her instructions religiously, turning my daily routine into a series of security protocols that made me feel like a prisoner in my own life. But it was better than the alternative. It was better than sitting there helpless while he watched. The dash cam footage became my obsession. Every night when I got home, I'd pull the memory card and review the recordings from the parking lot, the drive home, the time I'd spent inside the restaurant with my car sitting unattended. Most of it was nothing, just empty frames and passing traffic, but I kept looking anyway, convinced that sooner or later I'd catch something useful. A license plate, a clear shot of his face, some piece of evidence that would help the police track him down before he escalated further. 3 nights after I installed the dash cam, I found what I was looking for, and what I was looking for was so much worse than I'd imagined. The recording was from the previous evening, time-stamped during the dinner rush when I'd been buried in the kitchen for hours without a break. The dash cam had a motion sensor that activated whenever something moved within range of the lens, and it had triggered 7 times over the course of 2 hours. The first 6 clips showed nothing significant. A co-worker walking past, a stray cat investigating the tires, the headlights of cars pulling in and out of nearby spaces. But the 7th clip made my blood freeze in my veins. He was there, standing beside my car in the dim light of the parking lot, running his hand slowly along the driver's side door. Not trying to break in, not looking for something, just touching, caressing almost, his palm flat against the metal like he was petting an animal. The clip lasted 43 seconds, and for the entire duration, he never looked up, never seemed aware of the camera, just kept stroking my car with that disturbing intimacy. When he finally walked away, he pressed his lips to the window before disappearing out of frame. I watched that clip maybe 20 times, studying every detail I could extract from the grainy footage. The man was wearing the same dark jacket I'd seen before, and in the better lighting of the lot I could make out more of his features, the sharp angles of his cheekbones, the way his hair fell across his forehead, the strange blankness of his expression even while performing such an intimate act. He didn't look crazy. He didn't look homeless or desperate or any of the things that might have made this easier to understand. He looked ordinary, almost forgettable, the kind of man you'd pass on the street without a second glance. That made it so much worse somehow. The idea that someone so normal could harbor something so profoundly wrong. I sent the footage to Detective Reyes, who confirmed that it showed the same man from the police sketches we'd done based on my descriptions. She ran his image through facial recognition databases and came back with nothing. No criminal record, no driver's license on file, no social media presence, nothing. It was like he didn't exist outside of these moments when he materialized behind my car, in my back seat, pressed against my window in the dark. A ghost who only became real when he wanted me to see him. The restaurant management got involved after I showed them the footage. They were sympathetic in that corporate way that prioritizes liability over actual concern, and they arranged for security to escort me to my car at the end of every shift. It helped a little. Having another person there made me feel marginally safer, even though I knew it wasn't really protection. Just a witness, someone who could verify what happened if things went wrong. But even that small comfort evaporated when the security guard called in sick one night, and no one thought to tell me until I was already walking out the door. The parking lot was quiet, just my car and two others belonging to the bartenders who were still closing out their registers. I scanned the space carefully, checking between vehicles, looking for any sign of movement in the shadows at the edges of the lot. Nothing. I walked to my car quickly, keys already in my hand, and did the full check Detective Reyes had taught me. Circle the vehicle, look underneath, check the back seat through the windows before unlocking the doors. Everything was clear. I got in, started the engine, and looked at the backup camera. He was there. Not behind the car this time. Beside it, crouched next to my rear passenger door, his face pressed against the glass like a child looking into a fishbowl. The camera caught him in profile, his breath fogging the window, his lips moving like he was whispering something I couldn't hear. I laid on the horn and threw the car into drive, and in the rearview mirror, I saw him stand up slowly, still facing my direction, still moving his lips. I didn't stop until I reached the police station, and by then I was crying so hard I could barely see the road. Detective Reyes wasn't there. It was nearly 2 a.m, but the officer on duty took my statement and promised to send a patrol to check the restaurant lot. They didn't find anything, of course. They never found anything. The man was smoke and shadows, appearing and disappearing at will, and no amount of police presence seemed to make any difference. That night, sitting in the fluorescent glare of the police station waiting room, I made a decision. If the police couldn't find him, I would. I'd spent my whole life avoiding confrontation, avoiding risk, avoiding anything that might disturb the careful equilibrium of my existence. But this man had invaded every part of my life, had turned my car into a prison and my commute into a gauntlet. He'd made me afraid to look in my own mirrors, afraid to check my own back seat, afraid of the basic acts of driving that everyone else took for granted. I was done being afraid. It was time to find out who he was and what he wanted, even if the answer destroyed me. I started with the dashcam footage, going back through weeks of recordings with fresh eyes. Not just looking for him anymore, but looking for patterns, where he came from, where he went, anything that might tell me how he was finding me. It took 3 nights of squinting at grainy video before I noticed something I'd missed the first dozen times through. In one of the clips from the restaurant parking lot, just before he appeared beside my car, there was a reflection in the window of the SUV parked across from mine, a vehicle pulling into the lot from the street, headlights briefly visible, stopping at the far edge of the frame. A white van with dark lettering on the side that I couldn't quite make out. I found the same van in 2 other clips, always arriving shortly before he appeared and leaving shortly after he walked out of frame. It wasn't much. White vans were everywhere, delivery drivers and contractors and 1,000 other legitimate uses, but it was something concrete, something I could actually trace if I got lucky enough to catch the plates or the company name. The next night, I didn't go home after my shift. I parked my car in its usual spot and then walked 2 blocks to a coffee shop that had a clear sight line to the restaurant lot, settling into a window booth with a cup of coffee I didn't intend to drink. If he was going to show up, I wanted to see him coming. I wanted to see the van. I waited for almost 2 hours, watching the lot empty out as my co-workers left one by one, until only my SUV remained under the yellow glow of the security lights. Around 1:30, a white van turned off the main road and pulled into the far corner of the lot, its headlights cutting off as it rolled to a stop in the shadows. I couldn't see the driver from this distance, couldn't make out the lettering on the side, but I knew it was him. I could feel it in the way my pulse kicked up, the way my hands tightened around the cold coffee cup. He sat there for maybe 10 minutes, just watching my car from across the lot. Then the driver's door opened and a figure emerged. Same build, same dark jacket, same careful way of moving that I'd come to recognize. He walked toward my SUV with the unhurried confidence of someone who'd done this many times before, and I realized with a sick twist in my stomach that I'd probably been wrong about the timeline. This hadn't started when I first noticed him in my backup camera. This had been going on much longer, maybe since the day I bought the car, maybe before. I'd only caught him because the backup camera showed me what I wasn't supposed to see. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, whispering my location and the situation to the dispatcher while I watched him circle my car. He ran his hand along the hood this time, leaning down to peer through the windows, checking the doors. When he found them locked, he pulled something from his pocket, a slim metal tool that caught the light as he slid it into the gap between the door and the frame. He was breaking in, right there in the parking lot, with my empty car sitting under the security lights. He was breaking in like it was the most natural thing in the world. The dispatcher was telling me to stay where I was, that officers were on their way, but I couldn't just sit there and watch him violate my space again. I stood up from the booth and walked out of the coffee shop, my phone still pressed to my ear, my legs carrying me toward the parking lot before my brain could talk me out of it. I don't know what I was planning to do. Confront him, scream at him, demand to know why he'd chosen me out of everyone in the world to torment. I just knew I couldn't watch anymore. I couldn't be passive while he took pieces of my life I'd never get back. He saw me coming when I was maybe 50 feet away. His head snapped up from the car door, and for a long moment, we just stared at each other across the empty lot, me frozen mid-stride, him with his hand still on the tool jammed into my door. Then he smiled, that same small smile I'd seen through the backup camera a dozen times, and something in his expression made my blood turn to ice. "There you are," he said, and his voice was surprisingly normal, almost pleasant. "I was wondering when you'd stop hiding." I should have run. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around and get back to the coffee shop, to lock myself inside and wait for the police. But my feet wouldn't move, my body wouldn't cooperate, and all I could do was stand there as he pulled the tool from my door and started walking toward me. "Who are you?" My voice came out thin, barely audible. "Why are you doing this?" He tilted his head like I'd asked an interesting question, like we were having a casual conversation at a party instead of a confrontation in an empty parking lot at 2 a.m. "You don't remember me," he said, and there was something almost sad in his tone. "I didn't think you would. People like you never do." "Remember you from where? I've never seen you before in my life." "Yes, you have." He was maybe 20 feet away now, still walking, still smiling. 3 years ago, at the restaurant, you served me a steak that was overcooked, and when I sent it back, you came out of the kitchen and apologized personally. You looked right at me. You smiled at me. His voice dropped to something softer, more intimate. "No one ever looks at me. No one ever sees me. But you did. You saw me." The memory surfaced slowly, reluctantly. A busy Saturday night, a complaint about a steak, the head chef telling me to smooth things over before the customer made a scene. I'd gone to the table, apologized, offered a free dessert. Standard service recovery, something I'd done 100 times without thinking twice. I couldn't even picture the customer's face. It had been completely unremarkable, completely forgettable, just another body in a sea of diners who blurred together after enough double shifts. But he hadn't forgotten. He'd carried that 30-second interaction for 3 years, built it into something it was never meant to be. And now he was walking toward me in an empty parking lot with that awful smile and those empty eyes. "I've been watching you ever since," he continued, close enough now that I could see the individual hairs on his unshaven chin. "Learning your schedule, your habits, what kind of shampoo you use and what side of the bed you sleep on. I know everything about you. I know you better than anyone else in the world." Sirens cut through the night, distant but growing closer. His head turned toward the sound, and in that moment of distraction I finally broke free of whatever had been holding me in place. I ran, not toward the coffee shop, but toward the main road, toward the lights and the traffic and anywhere there might be other people. Behind me, I heard him curse, heard footsteps pounding on asphalt, and I pushed myself harder than I'd ever pushed in my life. The police cruiser came around the corner just as I reached the sidewalk, its lights painting everything red and blue. I threw myself toward it, waving my arms, screaming for help, and the officers were out of the car before it had fully stopped. One of them grabbed me, pulling me behind the vehicle while the other drew his weapon and pointed it at the man who'd stopped running about 30 feet back. "On the ground, now!" He didn't fight. He just stood there, in the middle of the road, his hands raised, that smile still playing at his lips as he looked past the officers directly at me. "I'll find you again," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. "You can't hide from someone who really sees you." Then he lowered himself to the pavement, and the officers moved in to cuff him. And I slid down the side of the police car and sat on the cold concrete, shaking so hard my teeth rattled. His name was Vincent Andrew Garza, and he'd been doing this for almost 15 years. The detectives told me what they found in his apartment over the course of several interviews, parceling out the information in careful doses like they were worried I might break if they gave me too much at once. He'd lived in a one-bedroom unit about 8 miles from the restaurant, close enough to make his nightly visits convenient, but far enough to avoid suspicion. The walls were covered with photographs, not just of me, but of 11 other women spanning back more than a decade. Former targets, Detective Reyes called them, women he'd fixated on and followed and watched until something broke the spell and he moved on to someone new. Some of them had reported stalking incidents. Most hadn't. A few had moved away, changed jobs, upended their entire lives to escape a threat they couldn't name or prove. And 2 of them, 2 women whose photographs occupied a special section of his wall, framed and mounted like portraits, had disappeared entirely. The police were still investigating those cases when I gave my testimony, and the prosecutor warned me that what started as a stalking trial might eventually become something much worse. Vincent had no criminal record before his arrest, which explained why he'd never shown up in any of the databases Detective Reyes had searched. He'd worked a series of unremarkable jobs over the years: delivery driver, warehouse stalker, night security guard, always positions that gave him flexible hours and access to places most people wouldn't think to look. The white van belonged to a cleaning company he'd worked for briefly, and he'd kept a copy of the key when they let him go. No one had ever reported it missing. No one had ever noticed him at all, which was exactly how he liked it. The psychologist who evaluated him for the trial used terms like erotomanic delusion and attachment disorder, clinical language that made his obsession sound almost like a disease instead of a choice. Vincent believed, genuinely believed, that the women he watched were in love with him too, that every small kindness, every moment of eye contact, every polite smile from a stranger was actually a secret message meant only for him. In his mind, he wasn't stalking anyone. He was waiting for them to acknowledge what they both already knew, waiting for the relationship he was certain existed to finally become real. The prosecutor asked me if I wanted to give a victim impact statement, and I spent 3 days writing something that would never be enough. How do you explain what it feels like to have your sense of safety stripped away? How do you describe the way I flinched every time I looked at my backup camera, the way I'd started taking 20 minutes to check my car before I could bring myself to get inside, the way I lay awake at night wondering if there were other cameras I didn't know about, other angles he'd found that were still capturing my life without my knowledge? I stood in front of the judge and read my statement in a voice that only shook a little, and Vincent watched me the whole time with that same small smile, like I was performing just for him. He got 18 years. The prosecutor had pushed for more, citing the evidence of Escalation and the 2 missing women whose cases remained unsolved, but the judge was limited by sentencing guidelines and the specific charges that had been proven. 18 years for stalking, breaking and entering, and criminal harassment. He'd be eligible for parole in 12, assuming good behavior, and the thought of that countdown running in the background of my life made me want to scream until my throat gave out. I quit my job at the restaurant 2 weeks after the trial ended. Couldn't stand being in that parking lot anymore. Couldn't handle the way my co-workers looked at me with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Luis hugged me on my last day and told me to take care of myself, and I promised I would, even though I wasn't sure what that meant anymore. Taking care of myself used to mean eating right and getting enough sleep and calling my mom once a week. Now it meant checking my mirrors obsessively and varying my routes and never, ever letting my guard down. I moved to a different city, a smaller one where the pace was slower and the streets felt less anonymous. Found a job at a local cafe that closed at 6 in the evening, well before dark, and rented a house with a garage so I'd never have to walk through a parking lot alone again. The garage door connects directly to the kitchen, and I've set up cameras at every angle. The driveway, the backyard, the street out front. I check the feeds every morning and every night, looking for white vans, looking for figures in dark jackets, looking for any sign that someone has found me again. My therapist says I'm making progress, but progress feels like a word from a language I used to speak. I don't have panic attacks as often as I did in the first year. I can drive at night now without my hands shaking on the wheel. I've even gone on a few dates, careful, controlled evenings with men who passed background checks I ran before agreeing to meet them. But there's a part of me that's always watching, always waiting, always braced for the moment when I look at my backup camera and see a face staring back. I think about the other women on Vincent's wall sometimes, the ones who got away, the ones who disappeared, the ones who might still be out there rebuilding their lives the way I'm trying to rebuild mine. I wonder if they check their mirrors too. I wonder if they've ever managed to stop. I reached out to a few of them through Detective Reyes, and we've formed something like a support group, trading messages about our progress and our setbacks and the particular kind of trauma that comes from being watched by someone who believes they love you. It helps, a little. Knowing I'm not alone helps. Vincent writes me letters from prison. The first one arrived about 6 months after his sentencing, forwarded through Detective Reyes because he'd somehow gotten my new address despite the protective order. She intercepted it before it reached me, but she told me what it said. That he missed me, that he thought about me every day, that he knew I was waiting for him the same way he was waiting for me. There have been 7 more since then, each one documented and added to a file that might matter someday if he ever gets out and decides to find me again. I try not to think about that. I try to focus on the life I'm building, the friends I'm making, the small daily victories that feel enormous when you're measuring them against total despair. Some days are better than others. Some nights I sleep straight through without dreaming about empty parking lots and faces in my rearview mirror. But I still check my backup camera every single time I get in the car. I still hold my breath for that half second before the screen flickers to life, waiting to see if there's something behind me that shouldn't be there. Old habits, I guess. Or maybe not habits at all. Maybe just the new shape of my life, the permanent scar tissue that forms over a wound that never quite heals. 12 years until he's eligible for parole. That number lives in my head like a countdown timer, always ticking, always reminding me that this isn't really over, it's just on pause. And when the timer reaches 0, I'll have to decide what kind of person I want to be, the one who runs, or the one who finally stops looking in the mirror. I haven't decided yet, but I've got 12 years to figure it out, and this time, I'll be the one watching. Story 3, the gas station door that locked me inside. I should have kept driving. That's what I tell myself now, every time I close my eyes and see those fluorescent lights flickering above the snack aisle. I should have pushed through the exhaustion for another hour, found a well-lit truck stop on the interstate, done anything other than pull off at that exit in the middle of nowhere because my gas gauge was dipping toward empty and I was too tired to think straight. But hindsight is worthless when you're standing in a locked room with someone who has no intention of letting you leave. The road trip had been my idea, a solo drive from Phoenix to Portland to clear my head after a breakup that had left me feeling hollowed out and directionless. My friends thought I was crazy for wanting to do it alone, but that was exactly the point. I needed to prove to myself that I could be alone, that I didn't need Tyler or anyone else to feel complete. So I'd loaded up my car with snacks and podcasts and a playlist of songs that didn't remind me of him, and I'd set off on a journey that was supposed to be about finding myself. Instead, I found something else entirely. It was just past 1 a.m. when I saw the sign, gas, food, 2 miles. I'd been driving for almost 8 hours by then, my eyes burning and my back aching from sitting in the same position for too long. The smart thing would have been to find a motel and call it a night, but I was making good time and didn't want to stop until I absolutely had to. The gas gauge said I had about 40 miles left in the tank, which wasn't enough to risk passing up what might be the last station for a while on this empty stretch of highway. I took the exit and followed a 2-lane road through darkness so complete it felt like driving into a void. The gas station appeared around a bend, a small concrete building with 2 pumps out front and a sign that just said fuel in letters that had probably been red once but had faded to a muddy brown. The parking lot was empty except for a pickup truck parked around the side, presumably belonging to whoever was working the night shift. The lights inside were on, casting a sickly yellow glow through windows that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years. Everything about the place felt wrong, too isolated, too quiet, too far from anything that resembled civilization. But I was running on fumes in more ways than one, and I didn't have the energy to second-guess myself. I pulled up to the pump and got out, the night air hitting me like a slap after hours in my climate-controlled car. It was colder than I'd expected for this time of year, with a wind that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The pump was ancient, the kind with a mechanical display instead of a digital screen, and when I lifted the nozzle and squeezed the handle, nothing happened. I tried again, checked the settings, even banged on the side of the machine like that might help. Still, nothing. A hand-lettered sign I hadn't noticed before was taped to the pump. Pay inside first. I looked at the building, at those grimy windows and that sickly light, and felt something cold settle in my stomach. There was no logical reason to be afraid. It was just a gas station, just a tired clerk waiting out a long shift, just the mundane reality of traveling through rural America in the middle of the night. But some part of my brain, some ancient instinct that had kept my ancestors alive long enough to pass on their genes, was screaming at me to get back in the car and drive away. 40 miles on fumes. I could make it. I could find somewhere else. Instead, I grabbed my wallet and walked toward the door. The interior was exactly what I'd expected. Scuffed linoleum floors, metal shelves stocked with the usual gas station fare, a cooler humming along the back wall with rows of sodas and energy drinks behind foggy glass. What I hadn't expected was the emptiness. There was no one behind the counter, no clerk visible anywhere in the small space. The register sat unattended, a small television mounted above it, playing what looked like a hunting show with the sound turned off. A door marked employees only stood slightly ajar at the back, but no light came through the gap. Hello? My voice sounded strange in the silence, too loud and too small at the same time. I need to pay for gas. No response. I waited a beat, then another, listening for any sign of movement from the back room. Maybe the clerk was in the bathroom. Maybe they'd stepped out for a smoke and would be back any second. I walked up to the counter and looked for a bell or some way to signal my presence, but there was nothing. Just the register, the muted television, and a row of scratch tickets in a plastic display case. I was about to call out again when I heard the door lock behind me. It wasn't a subtle sound, a heavy mechanical thunk that echoed through the empty store like a gunshot. I spun around and saw that the door I'd just come through, the door that had swung open freely when I'd walked in, was now sealed shut. Through the glass, I could see my car sitting at the pump, could see the dark parking lot and the road beyond. But when I grabbed the handle and pulled, nothing happened. I pushed instead, threw my shoulder against it, felt the frame rattle in its housing without giving an inch. The door was locked, and I hadn't seen anyone lock it. What the hell? I yanked on the handle again, harder this time, panic starting to flutter in my chest. Hey, is someone there? The door is stuck. A sound from behind me made me freeze, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the direction of the back room. I turned and saw that the employee's only door had swung open wider, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. The footsteps stopped, and for a long moment the only sound was my own breathing, too fast and too shallow. Then a voice came from the darkness, soft and almost amused. Stuck isn't exactly the right word. I locked it. I always lock it when someone interesting comes in. A man stepped out of the shadows, and everything about him was wrong. He was tall and thin, with a face that might have been handsome once, but had gone gaunt and hollow, like he'd been sick for a long time or hadn't eaten in weeks. His clothes were stained with something dark that I didn't want to look at too closely, and his smile. God, his smile was the worst part. Too wide, too eager, stretching across his face like it was pulled there by hooks. "Welcome to my store," he said, still smiling. "I've been waiting a long time for someone like you to stop by." My brain couldn't process what was happening fast enough. Part of me was still trying to fit this into a normal framework, a weird employee playing a prank, a misunderstanding about closing time, anything that would explain why I was locked inside a gas station with a man whose smile made my skin want to crawl off my body and run away without me. But another part of me, the part that had been screaming to stay in the car, understood exactly what was happening. I was in danger, real danger, the kind you read about in news articles and true crime podcasts and swear will never happen to you because you're smarter than that, more careful than that, different somehow from all the other women who ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time. "I just need gas," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, like my body had decided to handle the fear without consulting me first. $20 on pump 1. I can leave the money on the counter if you want." The man tilted his head, studying me the way a cat studies a mouse. It's not quite ready to kill yet. He was maybe 50, maybe older, hard to tell with his skin stretched so tight over his bones. And there was something in his eyes that didn't look entirely human. Not crazy exactly. More like empty. Like whatever was supposed to be behind them had leaked out a long time ago and left nothing but hunger in its place. "You don't understand," he said, taking a step closer. "No one leaves until I say they can leave. That's how it works here. That's how it's always worked." I backed up until I hit the counter, my hip colliding painfully with the edge of the register. My phone was in my pocket, I realized. I could call for help, call 911, get someone out here to break down this door and drag this man away. But when I reached for it, his smile widened and he shook his head slowly like I was a child trying to get away with something obvious. "No signal out here, miles from the nearest tower." He tapped his temple with one long finger. "I chose this place carefully. Took me years to find somewhere this perfect. No neighbors, no traffic, no one to hear anything that happens inside these walls." His eyes drifted toward the back room, and something in his expression shifted into what might have been nostalgia. The last girl who stopped by tried her phone too. Tried everything, really. They all do at first. The last girl. The words hit me like a fist to the stomach. This wasn't random, wasn't spontaneous, wasn't a one-time thing. This man had done this before, probably many times, luring travelers off the highway into his isolated trap. And I'd walked right into it, ignored every instinct telling me to run, because I was tired and my tank was low, and I'd convinced myself that bad things only happen to other people. "What do you want?" I asked, forcing myself to keep my voice level even as my insides turned to water. "Money? My car? I'll give you whatever you want. Just let me go." He laughed at that, a dry, rattling sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "I don't want your money. I don't want your car. Those things don't mean anything out here." He gestured around at the dirty store, the flickering lights, the shelves stocked with food that probably hadn't been touched in months. "What I want is company. What I want is someone to stay for a while, someone who'll listen to what I have to say. You'd be amazed how lonely it gets running a place like this. Hours go by without a single customer, days sometimes. A man can start to lose himself in all that quiet." There was something almost plaintive in his voice, almost human, and for one delusional second I thought maybe I could talk my way out of this. Maybe he was just lonely, just desperate for connection, and if I played along long enough, I could find an opening to escape. But then I looked past him, through the door he'd emerged from, and I saw something that killed that hope before it could fully form. There were scratches on the wall just inside the back room, deep gouges in the drywall, clustered near the floor, the kind of marks fingernails might make if someone was being dragged across them. and below the scratches, barely visible in the dim light that filtered through from the store, were stains. Dark, rust-colored stains that spread across the floor in patterns I didn't want to examine too closely. "You're looking at my workshop," the man said, following my gaze. He sounded almost proud, like a homeowner showing off a renovation. "It's not much, but it suits my needs. Sound doesn't carry well through these walls, another reason I chose this location. You could scream loud enough to tear your throat out and no one would ever know. I needed to get out. I needed to find a weapon, break a window, do something other than stand here waiting for whatever he had planned." My eyes darted around the store, cataloging potential options. A display of pocket knives by the register, a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall near the coolers, glass bottles that could be broken and used as improvised weapons. None of them were close enough to grab without him cutting me off, and he was positioning himself between me and anything that might help, like he'd done this dance before and knew all the steps. "I can see you thinking," he said, and the smile had faded into something colder, more businesslike. "That's good. I like the smart ones. They last longer, put up more of a fight." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a key ring, heavy with more keys than any gas station could possibly need. "But let me save you some time. The windows are reinforced. Looks like regular glass, but it's not. The back door is steel, dead-bolted from the outside. And even if you manage to get past me, which you won't, my truck is the only vehicle for miles that actually runs. Your car?" He jingled the keys. "I've been watching you pump nothing into your tank for the last 5 minutes. You're not going anywhere." My stomach dropped as I remembered the broken pump, the pay inside first sign, the way I'd walked right into this building without questioning why a working gas station wouldn't have working pumps. It had been a trap from the beginning, every detail designed to funnel someone like me, tired, alone, desperate, into this room where no one could hear and no one would come looking. "People know where I am," I said, grasping at anything that might make him hesitate. "I texted my friends my route. If I don't check in by morning, they'll call the police." The man's smile returned, patient and terrible. "No, you didn't. You told me yourself when you pulled in. I was watching from the back, saw you on your phone before you got out. You weren't texting. You were scrolling through music." He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell him now. Sweat and something sour, something that reminded me of meat left out too long in the sun. "I'm very good at watching. I've had a lot of practice." Behind me, the muted television flickered to a new scene. Hunters posing with a dead deer, grinning into the camera. Outside, my car sat useless at the pump, and the road stretched empty in both directions, and there was no one coming to save me. Whatever happened next, I was going to have to save myself. He must have seen something shift in my expression, because he moved before I did, lunging forward just as I grabbed the display of scratch tickets and hurled it at his face. The plastic case caught him in the shoulder instead of the head, but it was enough to make him stumble, and I used that half second to bolt for the fire extinguisher mounted on the wall near the coolers. My fingers closed around the handle and ripped it free from its bracket, spinning around just in time to see him recovering, that terrible smile replaced by something colder and more focused. "That was a mistake," he said, and his voice had dropped to something low and dangerous. "I was going to make this easy for you. I was going to be gentle, let you adjust. But if you want to do it the hard way, we can do it the hard way." I didn't waste breath responding. I pulled the pin on the extinguisher and squeezed the trigger, sending a blast of white chemical powder directly into his face. He screamed, a raw, animal sound that barely sounded human, and threw his hands up to protect his eyes, staggering backward into a shelf of snacks that collapsed under his weight. I didn't wait to see if he'd stay down. I ran for the front door, slamming into it with my full weight, praying that somehow the lock had failed or the frame had weakened or some miracle would let me through. The door held. Of course it held. He'd said the windows were reinforced, and he'd probably reinforced everything else too, built this place into a cage that no amount of desperation could break. I spun around, looking for another option, and that's when I noticed the door behind the counter, not the employee's only entrance to his workshop, but a smaller door half hidden by a display of cigarettes. A supply closet maybe, or a bathroom, somewhere to hide, to buy time, to find something I could use. I vaulted over the counter and yanked the door open, throwing myself inside and slamming it shut behind me. There was a lock, a flimsy push-button thing that wouldn't hold for long, but it was better than nothing. I pressed my back against the door and tried to catch my breath, tried to think, tried to figure out what the hell I was going to do now that I'd traded one cage for a smaller one. The room was a bathroom, just like I'd guessed. A single toilet, a cracked sink, a mirror spotted with age and grime. No windows, no other exits, no weapons beyond a plunger and a toilet brush that wouldn't do much against a man twice my size. But there was something else, something that made my breath catch in my throat when I turned on the light and saw it clearly. Writing on the walls, dozens of messages scratched into the paint with fingernails or keys or whatever else the authors could find, layered over each other in a desperate palimpsest of terror. Names and dates and fragments of sentences that made my blood run cold. Help me, Carla, 2019. He took my keys. 3 days now. Someone please, don't trust him. I can hear him outside. Tell my mom I love her. Jessica M. I counted at least 15 different handwriting styles before I stopped counting. 15 women, maybe more, who'd stood in this exact bathroom trying to leave some record of their existence before whatever happened next. Some of the messages were old, the scratches worn smooth by time. Others looked fresher, the paint flecks still clinging to the gouges. The most recent one was near the bottom of the door, right where someone crouching might have written it. June 2024. They never found the others. Basement. June 2024. 3 months ago. 3 months since someone had stood in this room, leaving a message for whoever came next, and now I was here reading it like a letter from a ghost. A fist slammed against the door, and I nearly screamed. The whole frame shuddered with the impact, the flimsy lock rattling in its housing. You're making this harder than it needs to be, the man's voice called from the other side, thick with rage and something that might have been chemical irritation. I've got all night. I've got all week. How long do you think you can stay in there before you get hungry? Before you get tired? Before you realize there's no way out except through me? I looked at the message again. Basement. There was a basement somewhere in this building, and according to whoever had written this, that's where the others were. Not buried in the back room, not disposed of somewhere in the desert, still here, somewhere below my feet, and the thought of what that might mean made me want to curl up in a ball and wait for death. But I wasn't going to die in this bathroom. I wasn't going to become another name scratched into the wall, another ghost leaving warnings for victims who came too late. If there was a basement, there might be another way out, a delivery entrance, a storm cellar, something this man hadn't thought to seal because he never expected anyone to get this far. It was a thin hope, barely a hope at all, but it was all I had. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, examining every inch of the small space. The floor was covered in the same scuffed linoleum as the rest of the store, but in one corner, near the base of the toilet, there was a seam, a rectangular outline that didn't quite match the rest of the flooring. I dropped to my knees and dug my fingernails into the edge, prying at it until a section lifted away to reveal a wooden hatch underneath. Rusted hinges, a recessed handle, and beyond it, darkness. The pounding on the door intensified. "What are you doing in there? Open this door right now!" I pulled the hatch open, and a smell hit me that made my stomach heave. Damp earth and mold and something underneath that I recognized from biology class, from the time we'd dissected frogs, and the formaldehyde hadn't quite covered the scent of decay. Whatever was down there, it wasn't just a basement, it was a burial ground, but it was also my only chance. I lowered myself through the hatch, my feet finding a wooden ladder that creaked under my weight. The darkness below was absolute, pressing against me like something physical, and I could hear sounds from down there, scratching, shuffling, things I didn't want to identify. Behind me, I heard the bathroom door finally splinter, heard the man's footsteps crossing the small space, heard his voice rising in fury when he saw the open hatch. "You stupid girl, you have no idea what you've just done." I let go of the ladder and dropped the last few feet into the darkness, landing hard on packed earth that sent pain shooting through my ankles. Then I ran, blind and terrified, into whatever waited in the basement below. My phone flashlight cut a narrow beam through the darkness, revealing fragments of the space around me in stuttering glimpses. Earthen walls shored up with rotting timber, a low ceiling that forced me to hunch as I moved. The floor was uneven, packed dirt that had been disturbed in places, mounded in others, and I tried not to think about what those mounds might contain. The smell was overwhelming. That thick, sweet stench of decomposition mixed with something chemical, something sharp that burned my nostrils and made my eyes water. Behind me, I heard him coming down the ladder. His movements were slower than mine had been, more deliberate, like he knew there was nowhere for me to go, and he could afford to take his time. The beam of a much stronger flashlight swept across the ceiling above me, and I pressed myself against the wall, trying to make myself small, trying to become invisible in the shadows. "There's no way out down here," he called, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "This is where they all end up eventually, where they all stay. You might as well come out now and save yourself the trouble." I kept moving, one hand trailing along the wall to guide me, the other holding my phone with the flashlight pointed at the ground so he couldn't track the glow. The basement was larger than I'd expected, not just a single room, but a series of connected chambers, like someone had been digging for years, expanding their underground kingdom one shovelful at a time. I passed through a narrow opening and found myself in a space that made my heart stop. They were everywhere. Not bodies, not exactly, but what was left after a body had been there for a long time. Bones arranged in careful patterns along the walls, skulls placed in alcoves like decorations, smaller fragments piled in corners like offerings. It was a shrine, a catacomb, a monument to whatever sickness lived inside the man who had built it. And among the bones, hung from hooks driven into the earthen walls, were personal effects. Purses, jewelry, shoes, a child's backpack that made my stomach lurch with horror. Souvenirs from every victim who had stopped at that gas station and never left. I counted at least 20 sets of remains before I forced myself to stop counting. 20 women, maybe more, who had come down here and never come back up. 20 families who would never know what happened to their daughters, their sisters, their mothers. I wanted to scream, wanted to collapse, wanted to give up and let the darkness take me the way it had taken all of them. But somewhere in the back of my mind, the message on the bathroom wall was still echoing. They never found the others. Someone had known about this place and still escaped. Someone had lived long enough to write that warning. If they could do it, so could I. I kept moving, pushing deeper into the labyrinth, searching for anything that might be an exit. The chambers grew narrower the farther I went, the ceiling pressing lower until I was crawling on my hands and knees through dirt that felt damp and wrong. My flashlight flickered once, twice, and I said a silent prayer to whatever God might be listening that the battery would hold out just a little longer. Then I saw it. A faint rectangle of something that wasn't quite as dark as everything around it, set into the wall at the far end of the narrowest tunnel. A door. A hatch. Some kind of exit that the man might have forgotten about, or might not have bothered to seal because he never expected anyone to make it this far. I scrambled toward it, my knees scraping against rocks and roots, my breath coming in ragged gasps that echoed too loud in the confined space. The hatch was wooden, warped with age and moisture, held closed by a simple latch that had rusted but not locked. I shoved against it with my shoulder, felt it give slightly, shoved again with everything I had. The wood groaned and then burst outward, and suddenly I was tumbling through into cold night air, into starlight and wind, and the smell of sage and dust that meant I was outside, I was free, I was alive. I emerged behind the gas station, maybe 50 feet from where my car was parked. The hatch had been hidden by a pile of old tires and scrap metal, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. I didn't stop to appreciate my luck. I just ran, sprinting toward my car, praying that my keys were still in my pocket where I'd left them. They were. My fingers closed around the familiar shape as I reached the driver's side door, and I had it open, and the engine started before I even processed that I was sitting down. The gas gauge still showed nearly empty, but I didn't care. I'd drive on fumes, drive on hope, drive until the engine died, and then run the rest of the way if I had to. I threw the car into reverse, and that's when I saw him in my backup camera, emerging from the front door of the gas station with something in his hand that glinted in the fluorescent light spilling from inside. He was running toward me, faster than I would have thought possible for a man his age, his face twisted into something that barely looked human anymore. I floored the accelerator and shot backward out of the parking lot, spinning the wheel to bring the car around. He was in my rearview mirror now, still running, still holding that glinting object, and I realized with a distant kind of horror that it was a machete, long and curved and stained with the same dark substance that had marked his clothes. I shifted into drive and pressed the gas pedal to the floor, and the car lurched forward onto the two-lane road, tires screaming against the pavement. I didn't look back again until I was 5 miles down the highway, and by then there was nothing behind me but empty road and darkness. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the car straight, and I was crying without realizing it, tears streaming down my face as the reality of what had happened finally broke through the adrenaline and the shock. The car made it 11 miles before the engine sputtered and died, coasting to a stop on the shoulder of the highway with its hazard lights blinking uselessly into the night. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the empty fuel gauge, listening to the wind whistle past the windows. Then I got out and started walking, one foot in front of the other, toward the distant glow of lights on the horizon that might have been a town or might have been a mirage. A truck driver found me 2 hours later, stumbling along the shoulder in the pre-dawn gray, and he must have seen something in my face because he didn't ask questions, just opened his door and helped me into the cab and drove me to the nearest hospital, where I collapsed in the emergency room and didn't wake up for almost 14 hours. When I finally opened my eyes, there were police officers waiting to talk to me, and I had a lot to tell them. They found him 3 days later, holed up in a hunting cabin about 40 miles from the gas station. He'd fled after I escaped, probably realizing that for the first time in decades, someone was going to tell the world what he'd done. The manhunt involved 4 counties and nearly 100 officers, and when they finally cornered him, he came out shooting. He didn't survive the encounter. Part of me wishes he had, wishes he'd been forced to sit in a courtroom and face the families of everyone he'd killed. But another part of me, the part that still wakes up gasping in the middle of the night, is grateful I'll never have to look at that smile again. His name was Earl Dean Womack, and he'd owned that gas station for 37 years. The property had belonged to his father before him, passed down through a family that locals described as private and kept to themselves, which I've learned is often code for something much darker. Earl had never married, never had children, never formed any connections that might have prompted someone to look too closely at what he was doing in that isolated building at the edge of nowhere. He'd existed in the margins of society, invisible and unremarkable, and that invisibility had allowed him to do unspeakable things for longer than I'd been alive. The final count was 23 confirmed victims, spanning from 1991 to the night I walked through his door. 23 women who'd made the same mistake I had, pulling off the highway with a low tank and a tired mind, trusting that a gas station was just a gas station, never imagining what waited inside. The forensic team spent almost 2 months excavating that basement, carefully documenting the remains and the personal effects and the meticulous records Earl had kept of every woman he'd taken. He'd written journals too, page after page of detailed accounts that the investigators wouldn't let me see, but whose existence was mentioned in court documents that became public after his death. They said he'd described each victim's final hours with clinical precision, like he was documenting a scientific experiment rather than the destruction of a human life. The messages on the bathroom wall helped identify 3 of the victims whose remains had been too degraded for other methods. Carla Mendez, taken in 2019 while driving to visit her sister in Nevada. Jessica Morrison, a college student who disappeared during a road trip in 2017, and the woman who'd written about the basement. Her name was Diana Webb, and she'd been reported missing just 3 months before I stumbled into that gas station. Her family had been searching for her ever since, and when the police finally called them with the news, her mother told reporters that at least now she knew her daughter had tried to warn others. At least Diana's last act had been one of compassion, even in the face of her own death. I testified at the inquest, even though Earl was already dead, because the families deserved to hear what had happened, and the authorities needed a complete record of his crimes. I sat in a room full of grieving people and described every detail I could remember: the locked door, the reinforced windows, the catacomb beneath the floorboards where he'd arranged his victims like trophies. Some of the families thanked me afterward for surviving, for escaping, for being the one who finally exposed what Earl had been doing all those years. Others couldn't look at me at all, and I understood that too. I was a reminder of what their loved ones hadn't been able to do, a living symbol of the escape that had been denied to 23 other women who'd been just as scared and just as desperate as I was. The gas station was demolished 6 months after the investigation concluded. The state bought the property and tore the building down to its foundation, then filled in the basement with concrete and covered the whole thing with dirt. There's nothing there now but an empty lot and a small memorial marker listing the names of everyone who died in that place. I've never been back to see it. I'm not sure I ever will. I didn't finish my road trip to Portland. After I was released from the hospital, I flew back to Phoenix and stayed with my parents for almost 3 months, sleeping in my childhood bedroom and barely leaving the house. The nightmares were worst in those early weeks. Vivid, suffocating dreams where I was back in that basement, crawling through tunnels that got narrower and narrower until I couldn't move at all, until I was just another set of bones arranged on an earthen wall. I'd wake up screaming and my mother would come running, and she'd hold me until I stopped shaking while my father stood helplessly in the doorway, wanting to fix something that couldn't be fixed. Therapy helped, eventually. So did time and medication, and the slow process of rebuilding a life that had been shattered into pieces I wasn't sure would ever fit together again. I moved to a new city where no one knew my story, found a job that kept me busy during the daylight hours, adopted a dog who sleeps at the foot of my bed and barks at every unfamiliar sound. Small comforts, small securities, small ways of convincing myself that the world isn't as dangerous as I now know it can be. I don't drive at night anymore. Haven't since it happened, probably never will again. The few times I've tried, I see gas stations glowing on the horizon and I feel my hands start to shake, feel my heart rate spike, feel that cold certainty settling in my stomach that something terrible is waiting inside. It doesn't matter that Earl is dead, that his gas station is gone, that the odds of encountering another predator like him are vanishingly small. The fear doesn't care about odds. The fear just knows what it knows, and what it knows is that I walked into a building one night and almost never walked out again. My therapist says I'm making progress. She says the fact that I can talk about it now, can write about it, can share my story with others, is a sign that I'm healing. Maybe she's right. There are days when I feel almost normal, when I can go hours without thinking about that night, when the memories feel distant and faded like something that happened to someone else. And then there are days when I catch a glimpse of a certain shade of fluorescent light, or I smell something chemical and sharp, and I'm right back in that store with the door locked behind me and nowhere to run. I think about the other women sometimes, the ones who didn't make it out, whose bones I crawled past in the darkness on my way to freedom. I think about Carla and Jessica and Diana, about the messages they left on those bathroom walls, about the hope they must have felt when they carved their names into the paint. They wanted to be remembered. They wanted someone to know they'd been there, that they'd fought, that they hadn't just disappeared without a trace. And now someone does. Now everyone does, because I survived to tell their story. That's what keeps me going on the hardest days. The knowledge that I'm alive because of them, because Diana wrote about the basement, because all those women left their marks on those walls and gave me the information I needed to escape. I carry them with me now, all 23 of them, and I try to live a life worthy of the chance they gave me. So if you're reading this and you're about to take a road trip, I want you to remember something. Trust your instincts. If a place feels wrong, if something in your gut is telling you to keep driving, listen to it. Don't let exhaustion or convenience or the simple need for gas override the voice in your head that knows when something isn't right. Because sometimes the door really does lock behind you, and sometimes there's no one coming to help. I got lucky. 23 other women didn't. Don't become number 24. My phone's flashlight cut a narrow beam through the blackness, illuminating glimpses of horrors I couldn't fully process. Rusted chains bolted to support beams, stained mattresses pushed against earthen walls, buckets and bottles and things I refused to look at closely. The basement was larger than the store above it, stretching back into darkness beyond the reach of my light, and the smell was everywhere now, thick and organic and inescapable. I pressed my sleeve against my nose and kept moving, searching desperately for anything that looked like an exit. Behind me, I heard him on the ladder, his weight making the old wood groan. "You shouldn't be down here," he called, and his voice echoed strangely in the underground space, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "This is private. This is my collection. You're ruining everything." I swept my flashlight across the walls and saw what looked like a door in the far corner. Heavy wooden planks with light leaking through the gaps between them. Actual light, pale and gray, which meant it led to the outside. A storm cellar entrance maybe, or an old coal chute, something from when this building was first constructed decades ago. I ran toward it, my feet slipping on the uneven ground, my breath coming in ragged gasps that I couldn't control. That's when I heard the voice. Not his. Someone else, weak and hoarse, coming from the darkness to my left. "Help, please." I stopped so abruptly I nearly fell. My flashlight swung toward the sound and found a shape huddled against the wall, wrapped in a filthy blanket, face so pale it seemed to glow in the darkness. A woman, young, maybe my age or a little older, with matted hair and eyes that squinted against even the feeble light of my phone. She was chained to a pipe that ran along the base of the wall, a heavy shackle around one ankle, and she was reaching toward me with fingers that trembled like leaves in a storm. Oh my God. I moved toward her without thinking, my survival instinct overridden by something more human. "How long have you been down here?" "I don't know." Her voice cracked on every word, rough from disuse or screaming or both. "Weeks, months." I stopped counting. She grabbed my arm with surprising strength, her nails digging into my skin. "You have to get out. They'll kill you." He killed the others. I heard them screaming. I heard everything. "You have to run." The footsteps on the ladder had stopped. I swung my flashlight toward the hatch and saw his legs descending, saw him dropping to the ground with the practiced ease of someone who'd made this journey many times before. He was between me and the ladder now, but the door with the light, was still ahead of me, still possible. "I'm not leaving you," I said, even as everything in me screamed that I had to go, had to run, had to save myself before it was too late. "Is there a key for the chain?" "He keeps it on him, always." She was crying now, tears cutting tracks through the grime on her face. "Please, don't let him take you too. Just go." I looked at the chain, at the pipe it was attached to, at the woman who might have been me if I'd stopped at this gas station a few months earlier. The pipe was old, corroded, held in place by brackets that had probably been installed before my parents were born. I grabbed the chain with both hands and braced my foot against the wall, pulling with every ounce of strength I had. "What are you doing?" His voice was closer now, and I could hear his footsteps approaching, deliberate and unhurried. He wasn't running. He didn't need to run. In his mind, we were already caught, already his, just 2 more additions to his collection in the dark. "You can't break that chain. I've tested it. They all tested it." The bracket groaned. The wall around it crumbled slightly, decades of moisture having weakened the mortar. I pulled harder, felt something in my shoulder strain toward tearing, and then, with a screech of rusted metal, the bracket ripped free from the wall. The chain was still attached to her ankle, but the other end was loose now, trailing on the ground like a tail as she struggled to her feet. "Go," I told her, pointing toward the door with the light. "I'm right behind you." She didn't argue. She ran, stumbled, really, her legs too weak to carry her properly, toward that promise of escape, and I turned to face the man who'd built this nightmare. He was maybe 20 feet away, close enough that I could see his expression in the glow of my flashlight. The chemical burns from the fire extinguisher had left red welts across his cheeks and forehead, and his eyes were bloodshot and weeping. But that smile was still there, still stretched across his face like a wound. In his hand was a knife, not the pocket knives from the store display, but something larger, something that had clearly been used before. "You're different," he said, and he sounded almost admiring. "Most of them just scream and cry and beg. But you fight. I like that. I'll remember you for a long time." I didn't have a weapon. The fire extinguisher was back in the store, and there was nothing within reach that I could use to defend myself. But I had one thing he didn't expect. I had nothing left to lose, and that made me dangerous in a way that no weapon ever could. I charged at him. He wasn't prepared for it. Every other woman he'd trapped had probably done exactly what he expected: run, hidden, cowered in the darkness while he hunted them down. But I threw myself at him like a wild animal, my nails raking across his already burned face, my knee driving toward his groin, every dirty trick I'd ever learned from self-defense classes and older brothers and sheer desperate instinct. He screamed and slashed with the knife, and I felt a line of fire across my forearm, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Stopping meant dying down here in the dark, becoming another name scratched into a bathroom wall, another woman no one ever found. My fingers found his eyes, the eyes already irritated by chemicals, already swollen and vulnerable, and I dug in with everything I had. His scream was inhuman, a sound of pure agony that echoed off the basement walls, and he dropped the knife to claw at my hands. I shoved him as hard as I could, felt him stagger backward, and then I ran. The woman was at the door, struggling with a rusty bolt that hadn't been opened in years. I reached past her and slammed my palm against it once, twice, feeling the metal scrape against its housing, and on the third hit, it slid free. I shouldered the door open, and we tumbled out into the gray pre-dawn light, a shallow stairwell leading up to ground level behind the building. The air hit me like a blessing, cold and clean, tinged with gasoline and sagebrush, the most beautiful thing I'd ever breathed. The woman collapsed on the ground, sobbing, and I grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the road, toward anywhere that wasn't here. Behind us, I heard him roaring from the basement, heard his footsteps on the stairs. But we had a head start, and the highway was right there, and in the distance, impossibly, miraculously, I could see headlights approaching, a semi-truck, its running lights glowing in the darkness, rumbling down the empty road at exactly the moment we needed salvation. I ran into the road, waving my arms, screaming for help, covered in blood and dirt and God knows what else from that basement. The truck's brakes screamed louder than I had, the massive vehicle shuddering to a stop just feet from where I stood. The driver's door flew open, and a man jumped out. A big man with a beard and a trucker cap and the most beautiful, confused expression I'd ever seen. "What the hell?" "Call 911, I gasped. "There's a man in the gas station. He's been killing people. Please, please call someone." The trucker's eyes went from me to the woman collapsed on the pavement to the gas station behind us, where a figure had just emerged from behind the building. Even from this distance, even in the growing light of dawn, I could see that terrible smile, could see him raising one hand in a wave that might have been goodbye or might have been a promise. Then the trucker was pulling us into his cab, was locking the doors, was calling 911 with shaking hands while he put the truck in gear and pulled away from that place of nightmares. And I sat in the passenger seat with a stranger's jacket wrapped around my shoulders, watching the gas station shrink in the side mirror, and I didn't start crying until it finally disappeared from view. Story 4. The Warehouse Worker Who Never Spoke. The thing about warehouse work is that you stop seeing the people around you after a while. Everyone becomes a blur of safety vests and steel-toed boots, anonymous bodies moving through the same motions, shift after shift, and unless someone does something to stand out, they fade into the background noise of conveyor belts and forklifts and the endless beeping of scanners. I'd been at Meridian Distribution for almost 2 years before I really noticed Raymond Gill, and by then he'd already been watching me for months. I worked the overnight shift, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., loading trucks in the shipping bay with a crew of about 15 other people who'd all made the same calculation I had. Night differential pay, plus overtime added up to a decent living if you could handle the hours. The work was physical but mindless, the kind of labor that let your body run on autopilot while your mind went somewhere else. Most nights I'd listen to podcasts through one earbud, keeping the other free so I could hear the warning horns of the forklifts, and the hours would slide past in a haze of cardboard and shrink wrap and the diesel smell of the loading dock. Raymond started about 8 months before everything happened, though I couldn't have told you the exact date. New hires came and went constantly in a place like Meridian. The turnover was brutal, especially on nights, and most people lasted a few weeks before deciding the money wasn't worth the exhaustion. I noticed Raymond the way you notice a new piece of furniture in a room you walk through every day, a vague awareness that something had changed, followed by immediate acceptance that it had always been that way. He was tall and thin, with pale skin that never seemed to tan despite the fluorescent lights, and he moved through his work with a quiet efficiency that made him almost invisible. The first thing that set him apart was the silence. Warehouse crews tend to be loud, shouting over the machinery, cracking jokes during breaks, complaining about supervisors and ex-girlfriends and the general unfairness of life. But Raymond never joined in. He'd sit alone during lunch, eating from a paper bag he brought from home, his eyes fixed on some middle distance that didn't include the rest of us. If you asked him a direct question, he'd respond with a nod or a shake of his head, occasionally a single word if absolutely necessary. But I never heard him initiate a conversation in all the time he worked there. Some of the guys thought he was deaf at first, but he responded to instructions just fine. He just chose not to speak. I asked our supervisor about him once, a few months after he started. Martinez was a decent guy who'd been running night shifts for almost a decade, and he usually knew the story behind everyone on his crew. But when I mentioned Raymond, he just shrugged and said the man did his job and didn't cause problems, which was more than he could say for half the people who'd come through that warehouse. Some folks are just quiet, he said. Nothing wrong with that. And I'd let it go, because Martinez was right. There was nothing wrong with being quiet, and Raymond wasn't hurting anyone by keeping to himself. The weather that winter was brutal, one of those seasons where the cold seemed to seep into everything, and the heating system in the warehouse couldn't keep up. We'd work in layers, peeling off jackets as we warmed up from exertion, and the concrete floor would leach the heat right out of your feet, no matter how thick your socks were. I remember the sound of the wind howling against the loading bay doors, the way it would gust through whenever someone opened them to back a truck in, carrying swirls of snow that melted into dirty puddles on the warehouse floor. It was during one of those cold snaps that I first caught Raymond watching me. I was stacking pallets near the back of the bay, working alone because my usual partner had called in sick, and I'd paused to adjust my gloves when I felt that prickle on the back of my neck, that instinctive awareness of being observed. I turned around and there he was, maybe 30 feet away, standing motionless between 2 rows of shelving with his eyes fixed directly on me, not looking in my general direction, not glancing over casually, staring with an intensity that made something cold twist in my stomach despite the sweat on my forehead. I raised my hand in an awkward wave, the way you do when you catch someone's eye across a room. Raymond didn't wave back. He just kept staring for another few seconds, his expression completely blank, and then he turned and walked away without acknowledging that anything had happened. I stood there for a moment, my hand still half raised, trying to figure out what I'd just experienced. It felt wrong somehow, not threatening exactly, but off in a way I couldn't articulate. Like I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to see, caught a glimpse behind a mask that was usually more carefully maintained. I told myself I was being ridiculous. The guy was quiet and a little strange, but that didn't make him dangerous. Maybe he'd just been lost in thought. Maybe he had some kind of social anxiety that made eye contact difficult. Maybe I was projecting my own discomfort onto someone who was perfectly harmless. I went back to my pallets and tried to forget about it, and for the next few weeks I almost succeeded. But I started noticing things after that. Little things, the kind you might dismiss individually, but that added up to something unsettling when you put them together. Raymond always seemed to be nearby when I was working, even when there was no reason for him to be in my section of the warehouse. He'd appear at the end of an aisle just as I was walking down it, or I'd look up from a task and find him a few rows over, facing my direction. During breaks, he'd position himself where he could see the table where I usually sat, his pale eyes tracking me even when he pretended to be focused on his food. And once, coming back from the bathroom at 3 a.m, I found him standing in the hallway outside the door, just standing there like he'd been waiting for something. "You need to use the restroom?" I asked, gesturing at the door behind me. He shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving my face. "Okay then." I edged past him, close enough to catch a faint smell that reminded me of something chemical, something sharp. "Have a good night." He didn't respond. He never responded. But as I walked back toward the shipping bay, I could feel his gaze following me the whole way, pressing against my back like something physical. That night, I went home and looked up Raymond Gill on every social media platform I could think of. I found nothing. No Facebook, no Instagram, no LinkedIn, no trace of him anywhere online. It was like he didn't exist outside the walls of that warehouse, like he only became real when he clocked in for his shift and disappeared back into nothing when he left. I should have listened to the voice in my head telling me something was wrong. I should have gone to Martinez, to HR, to someone who might have done something before it was too late. But I didn't want to be that person. The paranoid coworker who reports someone for being weird, who gets a quiet guy fired because she couldn't handle his social awkwardness. So I kept my concerns to myself and tried to convince myself that I was imagining things. I wasn't imagining things. I was just seeing the surface of something much deeper and much worse. The incidents escalated so gradually that I almost didn't notice the pattern forming. A few weeks after the hallway encounter, I came back to my locker during break and found a small object sitting on the bench in front of it. A hair tie, the exact shade of dark blue I always wore, coiled neatly like a tiny snake. I hadn't dropped it. I was wearing mine, had checked reflexively the moment I saw it sitting there. This was a different one, brand new, purchased specifically and placed where I would find it. I picked it up and looked around the locker room, but I was alone. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, that constant buzzing that becomes white noise after a while, and the metal lockers stood in silent rows like witnesses who refused to testify. I told myself it was coincidence. Someone else had dropped their hair tie. Someone else happened to use the same color. But when I opened my locker to put my jacket away, I found another one inside. Same color, same brand, sitting on top of my street clothes like a gift. My locker had a combination lock. No one else knew the code. I mentioned it to Destiny, one of the women on my crew who I'd gotten friendly with over the past year. We usually ate lunch together, trading complaints about the workload and gossip about our coworkers, and she was the closest thing I had to a real friend at Meridian. When I told her about the hair ties, she laughed it off at first. "Maybe you've got a secret admirer." But something in my expression made her stop smiling. "Wait, you're serious? That's actually creeping you out?" "It's the locker," I said. "I never told anyone my combination. How would someone even get in there?" Destiny frowned, stirring her instant noodles with a plastic fork. "These lockers are old as hell. Half the combinations are probably written down somewhere in the supervisor's office. Could be anyone." She paused, looking at me more carefully. "Has something else been going on? You've seemed kind of tense lately." I almost told her about Raymond then, almost described the staring, the way he always seemed to be nearby, the feeling of being watched that had become a constant presence in my shifts. But the words felt silly in my head, melodramatic, the kind of thing that would make destiny look at me with concern and suggest I was letting stress get to me. So I just shook my head and changed the subject, and we spent the rest of break talking about her sister's wedding drama instead. But I started paying closer attention after that. I kept a mental log of every time I spotted Raymond in my peripheral vision, every time I felt that prickle on my neck and turned to find him somewhere nearby. The numbers were staggering. In a single 8-hour shift, I counted 17 separate instances where he appeared in my line of sight when there was no work-related reason for him to be there. 17 times he happened to be walking past my station, or standing at the end of my row, or emerging from behind a stack of pallets just as I was looking in that direction. It was statistically impossible. It had to be deliberate. I started varying my patterns, trying to be less predictable. I'd take different routes through the warehouse, switch stations with coworkers when I could, take my breaks at odd times instead of the scheduled slots. None of it helped. Raymond adjusted seamlessly, like he could anticipate my movements before I made them, like he was somehow always one step ahead. I'd detour through the packaging section and find him already there, organizing boxes he had no reason to be organizing. I'd take my lunch 15 minutes early, and he'd be in the break room, sitting in his usual spot, watching the door as I walked through it. The other thing I noticed was that he'd started working the same shifts I did. Raymond had been hired for a different rotation originally. I remembered checking the schedule when I first became aware of him just to see how often our paths would cross. Back then, we'd only overlapped 2 or 3 times a week. Now it was every single night, every single shift, like he'd specifically requested to match my schedule. I asked Martinez about it as casually as I could, framing it as curiosity about how shift assignments worked, and he said Raymond had asked for more hours and nights were the only opening. It made sense on the surface. It made sense in all the ways that didn't matter. Then I found the photographs. It was a Thursday night, about an hour before the end of my shift, and I'd gone to the supply closet near the loading dock to grab a new roll of shrink wrap. The closet was more of a small room, really. Shelves stacked with packing materials, a workbench in the corner, a single bare bulb that flickered when you first turned it on. I was reaching for the wrap when my elbow knocked something off the shelf, sending it tumbling to the floor with a papery flutter. It was a notebook, spiral-bound, ordinary-looking, the kind you could buy at any dollar store. It had fallen open when it hit the ground, and what I saw on the pages made my heart stop. Photographs of me, dozens of them printed on regular paper, taped to the pages with handwritten notes beneath each one. Me walking to my car in the parking lot, me at my station loading pallets, me eating lunch with Destiny, laughing at something she'd said, me standing at my locker, my back turned, completely unaware that anyone was watching. The photos were grainy, clearly taken from a distance or zoomed in from far away, but they were unmistakably me. My face, my body, my life documented in obsessive detail. The handwriting beneath each photo was small and cramped, difficult to read in the dim light of the closet. I made out fragments. Beautiful today, wore the blue shirt, smiled at the supervisor, doesn't know I'm here. And then, on a page near the back, a longer entry that made my stomach turn inside out. She'll understand eventually. They always resist at first, but she'll see that we belong together. I just need to help her understand. I dropped the notebook like it had burned me, my hands shaking so badly I could barely control them. Raymond. This was Raymond's notebook, Raymond's photographs, Raymond's cramped handwriting describing a relationship that existed only in his head. I'd been right to be afraid. I'd been right about all of it, and now I had proof. Tangible, undeniable proof that the quiet man who never spoke had been building something terrible in the silence of his own mind. I should have taken the notebook straight to Martinez, straight to HR, straight to the police. That's what a smart person would have done, what a person who'd watched enough crime documentaries would have known to do. But I wasn't thinking clearly. I was running on fear and adrenaline, my brain cycling through worst-case scenarios faster than I could process them. So instead of doing the smart thing, I shoved the notebook back on the shelf where I'd found it, grabbed the shrink wrap I'd come for, and fled back to the warehouse floor like the room itself was chasing me. I needed time to think. I needed a plan, and I needed to figure out how to get through the next 4 hours of my shift without letting Raymond see that anything had changed. What I didn't realize was that he'd already seen everything. He'd been watching me from the shadows of the loading dock the whole time, and he'd seen exactly which closet I'd gone into and exactly how long I'd stayed. The next 4 hours were the longest of my life. I moved through my tasks on autopilot, stacking pallets and scanning boxes while my mind raced through options I didn't have. I needed to tell someone, needed to show them the notebook, needed to make this real before it got any worse. But every time I looked up, Raymond was there, at the far end of the aisle, near the supervisor's station, leaning against a support beam with his arms crossed and his pale eyes fixed on me like I was the only thing in the warehouse worth looking at. He knew. I could see it in the way he watched me now, something different in his posture, something expectant. The mask had slipped further, revealing whatever lurked underneath, and the blankness in his expression had been replaced by something that almost looked like anticipation. He was waiting to see what I would do, waiting to see if I'd run to Martinez or try to leave early or do any of the things a rational person would do when they discovered they'd been the subject of someone's obsession. And I realized with a sick twist in my stomach that he wanted me to react. He wanted an excuse to escalate, to move from watching to something more direct, so I didn't give him one. I kept my head down and my hands busy, counting the minutes until 6 a.m. when I could clock out and get in my car and drive somewhere, anywhere, that he couldn't follow. I'd go straight to the police station, I decided. I'd tell them everything, show them the notebook if it was still there, make them understand that I wasn't just some paranoid woman imagining threats. The sun would be up by then, and daylight felt safer somehow, like bad things couldn't happen when the rest of the world was awake. The shift ended without incident. I punched out at 6:02, grabbed my jacket from my locker, and walked toward the parking lot with my keys already in my hand. The morning air was cold and sharp, cutting through the exhaustion that had settled into my bones, and I'd never been so grateful to see my car sitting under the security lights at the far end of the lot. I was maybe 30 feet away when I realized I wasn't alone. Raymond was leaning against my driver's side door. He wasn't doing anything threatening, just standing there with his hands in his pockets, watching me approach with that same blank expression he always wore. But his presence was a threat in itself, a message that said, I know where you park, I know what you drive, I can find you whenever I want. I stopped walking, my heart hammering against my ribs, and for a long moment, we just looked at each other across the empty parking lot. I need to get to my car, I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. Can you move, please? He didn't respond. Of course he didn't respond. In all the months he'd worked at Meridian, I'd never heard him say more than a handful of words. But he did something worse than speaking. He smiled. Not the small, blank expression I'd seen before, but a real smile, wide and wrong, stretching across his gaunt face like something that didn't belong there. It was the smile of someone who'd been waiting a very long time for this moment, who'd rehearsed it in his head until it was perfect. I saw you, he said, and his voice was worse than his smile, soft and flat, like he was reading from a script he'd memorized. In the supply closet, you found my things. I took a step backward, calculating the distance to the warehouse door, wondering if I could make it back inside before he caught me. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. He pushed himself off my car and took a step toward me, still smiling that terrible smile. You read my notebook. You saw the pictures. You know how I feel about you now. Another step, closing the distance between us. I wanted to tell you myself when the time was right, but maybe this is better. Maybe you needed to see how much you mean to me. I was backing up steadily now, my eyes darting around the parking lot for anyone else, any witness, any help. The lot was empty. Night shift had ended, and day shift didn't start for another 2 hours, and we were completely alone in the gray morning light. My phone was in my pocket, but I didn't dare reach for it, didn't want to take my eyes off him for even a second. "Raymond, I'm going to go now," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, trying to sound like I wasn't terrified. "We can talk about this later, okay? I'm just really tired and I need to go home. We can go together." He said it like it was the most natural thing in the world, like we'd discussed this and agreed on it, like I'd somehow given him permission without knowing. "I've been getting everything ready. You'll like it, I think. It's quiet, private. No one will bother us there." The words hit me like ice water, snapping through the fog of exhaustion and fear. He'd been getting everything ready. This wasn't spontaneous, wasn't a spur-of-the-moment confrontation prompted by me finding his notebook. This was planned, prepared, something he'd been building toward for months while I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. And now he was standing between me and my car, talking about taking me somewhere private, and I understood with horrible clarity that if I got in a vehicle with this man, I was never coming back. I ran, not toward the warehouse. He was too close, would cut me off before I reached the door. I ran toward the road, toward the main entrance of the industrial park where there might be traffic, might be witnesses, might be anyone who could help. My boots pounded against the asphalt, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and I could hear him behind me. Not running, just walking, that same measured pace he used in the warehouse, like he knew I couldn't outrun him forever. The security gate was maybe 200 yards away, and beyond it I could see the headlights of cars passing on the main road. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, my legs screaming, and I was almost there, almost to the gate when my foot caught on a crack in the pavement, and I went down hard. The impact drove the air out of my lungs, and for a terrible moment I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, could only lie there on the cold asphalt while footsteps approached from behind. Then a hand closed around my ankle, firm, cold, dragging me backward, and I screamed louder than I'd ever screamed in my life. "Shut up!" His voice was different now, harder, the flat monotone replaced by something that sounded almost angry. "You're ruining it! This isn't how it's supposed to go!" I kicked out with my free leg, felt it connect with something solid, heard him grunt in pain. His grip loosened for just a second and I scrambled forward, my palms scraping bloody against the pavement. And then I was up and running again, limping now, my ankle throbbing where he'd grabbed it. A delivery truck was pulling through the security gate, its headlights cutting through the gray morning, and I threw myself in front of it, waving my arms and screaming. The driver slammed on his brakes, the truck shuddering to a stop maybe 10 feet from where I stood, and I ran to the driver's side door and pounded on it until he rolled down his window. "Help me," I gasped. "There's a man. He's following me. Please, you have to help." The driver, an older man with a concerned face, looked past me toward the parking lot. I turned to look too, expecting to see Raymond closing in, expecting to have to fight again. The parking lot was empty. Raymond was gone, vanished into the morning shadows like he'd never been there at all. But I knew he was watching from somewhere. He was always watching. "Miss, are you okay?" The driver was already reaching for his phone. "Do you need me to call someone?" I nodded, unable to speak, and leaned against the side of his truck while he dialed 911. The sun was just starting to break over the horizon, painting everything in shades of gold and pink, and I stood there bleeding and shaking and waiting for help to arrive. This wasn't over. I knew it wasn't over. But at least now I wasn't alone. The police took my statement in the Meridian parking lot while an ambulance crew cleaned the gravel out of my palms and wrapped my scraped knees in gauze. I told them everything: the watching, the hair ties, the notebook full of photographs, the confrontation by my car, the words that still echoed in my head. I've been getting everything ready. The officers listened with expressions that grew more serious the longer I talked. And by the time I finished, one of them was already on his radio calling for backup, while the other went inside to speak with management. They found the notebook exactly where I'd left it, on the shelf in the supply closet, and the contents were even worse than what I'd seen in my panicked glimpse. Over 200 photographs spanning almost 8 months, documenting every aspect of my life at Meridian with obsessive detail. But the photos from the warehouse weren't the worst part. Mixed in among them were pictures taken outside of work, me at the grocery store, me at the laundromat, me walking into my apartment building with my keys in my hand. He'd been following me home. For months, he'd been following me home, and I'd never noticed, never felt that prickle on my neck outside the warehouse walls. The address in his employee file led to a boarding house on the other side of the city. But when police arrived, the landlord said Raymond hadn't been back in over a week. He'd paid his rent through the end of the month and then simply stopped coming home, like he'd known something was about to change and had made other arrangements. His room was nearly empty, a mattress on the floor, a few changes of clothes, nothing personal except for a single photograph tacked to the wall above his pillow. It was me, taken through the window of my apartment, and I was sleeping. The detective assigned to my case was a woman named Orozco, who'd handled stalking cases before and didn't waste time on false reassurances. She told me straight out that Raymond's behavior fit a pattern she'd seen before. The escalating surveillance, the delusional beliefs about a relationship, the preparation for some kind of next step that the stalker believed would bring the victim into their life permanently. She said men like this didn't stop on their own. They either got caught or they got what they wanted, and I needed to understand that until Raymond was in custody, I wasn't safe. I couldn't go back to my apartment. Orozco arranged for me to stay with a friend outside the city, someone Raymond wouldn't know about, while they searched for him. I packed a bag without really seeing what I was putting in it, my hands moving on autopilot while my mind kept circling back to those photographs. That smile, the flat certainty in his voice when he'd said we could go together. Destiny came over to help me pack, her face pale and her eyes wet, apologizing over and over for not taking my concerns more seriously when I'd mentioned the hair ties. "It's not your fault," I told her, though I wasn't sure I believed it. I didn't take it seriously either, not until it was too late. The search for Raymond lasted 5 days. 5 days of jumping at every sound, of checking and rechecking the locks on doors, of sleeping in 2-hour stretches because my body refused to let down its guard for longer than that. Orozco called me every morning with updates that weren't really updates. No sightings, no credit card activity, no sign of him anywhere in the city or the surrounding areas. It was like he'd dissolved into thin air, becoming the ghost I'd always half believed he was. On the 6th day, they found his car. It was parked behind an abandoned manufacturing plant about 15 miles from Meridian, hidden from the road by overgrown brush and rusted equipment. The trunk was full of supplies: rope, duct tape, zip ties, a tarp, bottles of water and protein bars, everything you'd need to keep someone alive in a place where no one would hear them scream. And in the glove compartment, a hand-drawn map with a route traced in red marker, leading from the Meridian parking lot to an address in the countryside that the police didn't recognize. They sent a team to check it out, and what they found made Orozco's voice go flat and careful when she called to tell me. The address belonged to an old farmhouse that had been abandoned for years, property records showing it had once belonged to Raymond's family before being seized for unpaid taxes. He'd been fixing it up in secret, installing new locks, reinforcing the windows, soundproofing one of the rooms in the basement with materials that matched receipts found in his boarding house. The room had a bed, a small bathroom, and a heavy door that locked from the outside. He'd been building a cage. "How long?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. How long had he been working on it? Orozco paused before answering. Based on the receipts and the condition of the materials, at least 6 months, maybe longer. She let that sink in before continuing. We also found journals, detailed plans for how he intended to acclimate you, how he'd help you understand that you belonged together. He'd mapped out the first several weeks. I hung up the phone and vomited into the bathroom sink, my body rejecting the information my mind couldn't process. 6 months. He'd been building that room for 6 months while I'd dismissed my instincts, while I'd told myself I was being paranoid, while I'd gone about my normal life completely unaware that someone was constructing a prison cell with my name on it. If I hadn't found that notebook, if I hadn't run when he confronted me in the parking lot, I would have woken up in that basement, and no one would have known where to look. But they still hadn't found Raymond himself. The farmhouse was empty, the car abandoned, and wherever he'd gone after our confrontation in the parking lot, he'd left no trail for anyone to follow. Orozco said they were expanding the search, coordinating with neighboring jurisdictions, treating him as a dangerous fugitive. She said I should stay where I was, stay hidden, stay safe until they caught him. I tried. For 3 more days I tried to stay hidden, tried to trust that the police would find him before he found me. But on the 9th night after the parking lot, I woke up at 3 a.m. with that familiar prickle on the back of my neck, that instinctive awareness of being watched that I'd learned to trust too late. I sat up in bed and looked toward the window, and there he was, standing in the backyard of my friend's house, motionless in the moonlight, staring up at the window of the room where I was sleeping. He raised one hand in a slow wave, the same gesture I'd offered him months ago in the warehouse, and even from this distance I could see that terrible smile stretching across his face. I screamed for my friend to call 911, and by the time I looked back at the window, he was gone. But on the glass, written in what looked like condensation from his breath, were 2 words that made my blood freeze solid in my veins. Found you. The police arrived within minutes, but Raymond was already gone, melted back into the darkness like smoke through a screen. They searched the neighborhood for hours, brought in dogs, set up a perimeter that he'd somehow already slipped through. Orozco sat with me in my friend's living room while officers came and went, her face grim in the blue and red glow of the patrol lights outside. And she told me what I already knew. He wasn't going to stop. He'd found me once, he'd find me again, and no amount of hiding was going to change that. We need to draw him out, she said, on our terms, in a controlled environment. It's the only way this ends. I knew what she was asking. She wanted to use me as bait, to dangle me in front of Raymond like something shiny and wait for him to come close enough to grab. Every instinct I had screamed against it. The idea of deliberately putting myself in his path, of inviting him to come for me, felt like signing my own death warrant. But I was so tired of running, so exhausted from the constant fear and the sleepless nights and the feeling that my life had been hijacked by someone else's delusion. I wanted it to end. I needed it to end, one way or another. We set the trap 3 nights later at the Meridian warehouse. The plan was simple. I'd show up for my normal shift, make myself visible, give Raymond an opportunity he couldn't resist. The parking lot would be full of undercover officers in unmarked vehicles, and a tactical team would be positioned inside the warehouse, ready to move the moment he appeared. Orozco assured me I'd be safe, that they'd grab him before he got within 20 feet of me, that all I had to do was act normal and let them handle the rest. I didn't feel safe. I felt like a lamb staked out for a wolf, bleeding in the darkness while predators circled just beyond the firelight. But I put on my work clothes and drove to Meridian and walked through those warehouse doors like I had hundreds of times before, and I waited for Raymond to come finish what he'd started. He didn't make me wait long. It happened during my first break, around midnight. I'd gone to the vending machines near the loading dock, a spot I'd chosen specifically because it was visible from multiple angles where officers were positioned. I was feeding quarters into the slot, watching my reflection in the glass, when I saw movement behind me, a shape emerging from the shadows near the freight elevator, moving with that quiet efficiency I recognized even before I turned around. Raymond was wearing the same clothes he'd had on in the parking lot, stained now and wrinkled like he'd been sleeping rough. His face was gaunt, more hollow than before, and his eyes had a feverish quality that made him look less human than ever. But he was smiling, that terrible, wrong smile, and he had something in his hand that glinted under the fluorescent lights. "I knew you'd come back," he said, his voice soft and flat. "I knew you'd understand eventually." We're supposed to be together. You just needed time to realize it. I backed away slowly, my eyes on the knife in his hand, trying to remember where the nearest officer was supposed to be. The vending machine was behind me, a solid wall I couldn't pass through, and Raymond was between me and every exit I could see. He took a step closer, then another, and I realized with cold horror that something had gone wrong. The officers weren't moving, weren't announcing themselves, weren't doing any of the things Orozco had promised they'd do. "Raymond, please." I hated how small my voice sounded, how scared. "You don't have to do this. We can talk. We can figure something out." There's nothing to figure out. He was close enough now that I could smell him, that same chemical sharpness I'd noticed in the hallway all those months ago, mixed with something sour and unwashed. I've already figured everything out. The house is ready. Our life is ready. All that's left is you. He lunged. I threw myself sideways, crashing into a stack of pallets that toppled under my weight and sent me sprawling across the concrete floor. The knife whistled past my head, close enough that I felt the air move. And then Raymond was on top of me, his weight pinning me down, his free hand closing around my throat while the other raised the knife for another strike. I couldn't breathe, couldn't scream, couldn't do anything but claw at the hand, crushing my windpipe, while black spots danced at the edges of my vision. This is it, I thought. This is how it ends. In a warehouse, on a concrete floor, with a man who never spoke until he had something terrible to say. Then the gunshot. Raymond's body jerked, his grip loosening, and I sucked in a desperate breath as he slumped sideways off me. Blood was spreading across his shirt, blooming from a wound in his shoulder, and behind him I saw Orozco with her weapon raised, 2 uniformed officers flanking her with their guns also drawn. "Don't move," Orozco commanded, her voice sharp as steel. "Drop the knife and put your hands where I can see them." Raymond didn't drop the knife. He didn't put his hands up. He just looked at me with an expression that might have been confusion or might have been grief, like he genuinely couldn't understand why I wasn't happy, why I wasn't grateful for everything he'd done. Then he raised the knife again, not toward me this time, but toward the officers, and 3 more shots rang out in rapid succession. He was dead before he hit the ground. I lay there on the cold concrete, covered in his blood, staring at his face as the light went out of his pale eyes forever. Even in death, he didn't look angry or afraid. He just looked empty, like whatever had been driving him had finally been unplugged, and there was nothing left underneath. The investigation afterward revealed things I hadn't known, things that made the horror even worse. Raymond Gill wasn't his real name. It was an alias he'd been using for almost 10 years, one of several identities he'd cycled through over the years. His real name was Raymond Mercer, and he had a history that spanned 3 states and at least 4 other women who'd been the subjects of his obsession. 2 of them had obtained restraining orders. One had moved across the country to escape him, and one, a woman named Patricia Holbrook, had disappeared from her home in Ohio 8 years ago and never been seen again. They found Patricia's remains buried behind the farmhouse in a shallow grave about 50 feet from the soundproofed room Raymond had been building for me. She'd been his first, the police theorized, the one who'd taught him what he was capable of, the one who'd set him on the path that eventually led to Meridian distribution and a woman who reminded him of something he'd lost. I was supposed to be her replacement, her continuation, another body for the grave if I stopped cooperating with his delusion. I don't work at Meridian anymore. I don't work nights anywhere, and I probably never will again. I moved to a new city after the investigation concluded, found a job with daylight hours and open floor plans and no dark corners where someone could hide and watch without being seen. My therapist says I'm making progress, that the nightmares are less frequent now, that I'm learning to trust my environment again in small, measured ways, but I still feel him sometimes. Still catch myself scanning crowds for a tall, thin figure with pale eyes and a blank expression. Still wake up at 3 a.m. with that prickle on my neck, certain that someone is watching me from just beyond my line of sight. The fear hasn't gone away. It's just gotten quieter, more manageable, something I carry with me instead of something that carries me. Raymond never spoke because he didn't need to. His silence was a costume, a way of fading into the background while he built his obsession piece by piece. He spent 8 months learning everything about me, and I spent those same 8 months not learning anything about him because I didn't want to seem paranoid, didn't want to be the woman who reported a coworker for being quiet. So here's what I want you to take from my story. Trust the feeling. Trust the prickle on your neck, the unease you can't explain, the instinct that tells you something is wrong even when everything looks fine on the surface. The quiet ones aren't always harmless. Sometimes they're just waiting for the right moment to speak. And by then, it might be too late to answer. Story 5. The silhouette at the foot of my bed. The first time I saw her, I convinced myself I was dreaming. I'd been working 60-hour weeks at the firm, running on caffeine and desperation, and my sleep had become something fragmented and unreliable. 4 hours here, 3 hours there, punctuated by alarms and anxiety dreams about missed deadlines. It made sense that my exhausted brain would start playing tricks on me. It made sense that I'd wake up in the middle of the night and see shapes in the darkness that weren't really there. She was standing at the foot of my bed, motionless, just a darker shadow against the gray of my bedroom at 3 a.m. I couldn't make out any features, no face, no details, just a human-shaped absence of light that seemed to absorb what little illumination filtered through the curtains from the streetlight outside. I lay there frozen, my heart pounding, telling myself to blink, to move, to do something that would break whatever spell had settled over me. And then I did blink, and she was gone, and I was alone in my room with nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing and the distant hum of traffic on the highway. Sleep paralysis, I told myself. A hypnopompic hallucination, the kind that happens when your brain wakes up before your body does. I'd read about it online, seen people describe almost identical experiences, shadow figures, a sense of presence, the inability to move or speak. It was terrifying but harmless, a glitch in the neural software that meant nothing beyond the fact that I was stressed and sleep-deprived. I got up, drank a glass of water, and forced myself back to bed. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself it hadn't happened at all. I should tell you about the apartment because I think that's where all of this started. I'd moved in about 6 weeks before the first sighting, trading my cramped studio in the city for a 1-bedroom in a converted Victorian about 20 minutes outside downtown. The building had been divided into 4 units sometime in the 70s, and mine was on the 2nd floor, accessible by a wooden staircase that creaked no matter how carefully you climbed it. The rent was almost suspiciously cheap for the square footage, but the landlord, an older woman named Mrs. Castellano, who lived in the unit below mine, explained that the building had been in her family for generations and she wasn't interested in squeezing every dollar out of her tenants. It was a beautiful space in that old, slightly neglected way that Victorian architecture can be. High ceilings with crown molding, hardwood floors that sloped slightly toward the windows, a bay window in the living room that looked out over a quiet street lined with oak trees. The bedroom was at the back of the unit, facing a small courtyard that separated our building from the one behind it. At night, with the curtains drawn and the radiator clicking softly as it heated, it felt like being wrapped in something warm and safe, a cocoon against the noise and chaos of the outside world. I loved that apartment. For the first month, I was happier than I'd been in years, coming home each night to a space that felt like mine in a way my old studio never had. I'd make dinner in the galley kitchen, eat it on the couch while watching whatever was streaming, and fall asleep to the sound of the wind in the oak trees and the occasional car passing on the street below. If I'd known what was coming, I would have broken the lease and run. But I didn't know. I was just a tired man in a new apartment, grateful for a place that felt like home. The second sighting happened about a week after the first. Same circumstances, waking up suddenly in the small hours. That disorienting moment of not knowing where you are or what pulled you from sleep. And there she was again, standing at the foot of my bed. That same featureless silhouette. That same absolute stillness. This time I tried to speak, tried to demand who she was and what she was doing in my room, but my voice wouldn't work. The words stuck in my throat like something physical, and all I could do was lie there staring, while she stared back with a face I couldn't see. She stayed longer this time, long enough for me to notice details I'd missed before. The shape of her, which seemed feminine somehow despite the lack of features. The way she stood with her arms at her sides and her head tilted slightly to the left, like she was studying me the way I was studying her. Long enough for me to feel something beyond fear, something that crept into my chest and settled there like a cold weight. She wasn't just watching me. She was waiting for something. I could feel it in the air between us, that patient expectation, that sense of a clock ticking toward an hour I didn't want to reach. Then I blinked, and she was gone again. No transition, no movement. Just there one moment and absent the next, like she'd never existed at all. I didn't go back to sleep that night. I turned on every light in the apartment, checked every closet and corner, made sure the front door was locked and the windows were latched. There was no one there. No sign that anyone had been there. No evidence of forced entry. Nothing to suggest that what I'd seen was anything more than my own exhausted mind turning shadows into monsters. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that some boundary had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. The apartment that had felt so safe now felt like something else entirely, a stage, maybe, where I was performing for an audience I couldn't see. I started researching sleep paralysis more seriously after that, reading medical journals and Reddit threads and everything in between. The experiences people described matched mine almost exactly. The shadow figure, the inability to move, the overwhelming sense of presence. Some cultures had names for it: the old hag, the nightmare, the demon that sits on your chest and steals your breath. It was universal, ancient, a shared human experience that crossed every border and every era. There was comfort in that, in knowing that millions of people throughout history had seen the same thing I was seeing and lived to tell about it. But there was one detail that didn't fit, one thing that nagged at me even as I tried to file the whole experience away as a neurological curiosity. Sleep paralysis happens when you're between states of consciousness, when your body is still locked in the muscle atonia of REM sleep, even as your mind wakes up. The hallucinations occur because you're essentially dreaming with your eyes open, your brain projecting images onto the real world. The thing is, I could move. Both times I'd seen her. I'd been frozen, not because my body wouldn't respond, but because I was too afraid to try. And when I finally did move, when I blinked, when I sat up, when I turned on the lights, my body obeyed perfectly. There was no paralysis. There was just fear and a figure at the foot of my bed, and the growing suspicion that what I was seeing might not be a dream at all. I told myself I was overthinking it, told myself that fear could mimic paralysis, that the mind could play all kinds of tricks when it was desperate for sleep. I told myself a lot of things in those first weeks, building walls of rationalization between myself and the truth I didn't want to face. The walls came down on a Thursday night, 3 weeks after the first sighting, when I woke up at 2:47 a.m. and found her standing not at the foot of my bed, but right beside it, close enough that if I reached out, I could have touched her. And this time, when I fumbled for the lamp on my nightstand and flooded the room with light, she didn't vanish. She smiled at me, and then she ran. It happened so fast, I almost couldn't process it. One moment she was there. Not a shadow now, but a real person. A woman with dark hair and pale skin, and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. And the next, she was moving, bolting through my bedroom door into the darkness of the hallway beyond. I heard footsteps, heard the front door bang open, heard the wooden staircase creaking and groaning under running feet. By the time I got out of bed and stumbled after her, she was gone, vanished into the night like she'd never been there at all. I stood in my doorway for a long time, staring at the front door that hung open onto the landing, letting cold air pour into my apartment. My hands were shaking, my whole body was shaking, that full-body tremor that comes from adrenaline with nowhere to go. A woman had been in my bedroom. A real, living woman had been standing beside my bed, watching me sleep, and I had no idea how long she'd been there or how many times she'd done it before. The sleep paralysis, the shadow figure, the silhouette that vanished when I blinked. None of it had been a hallucination. It had been her, every single time, standing in the dark and waiting for me to fall back asleep so she could keep watching. I called the police, but even as I dialed, I knew how the conversation would go. A woman was in my apartment, I'd tell them. She was watching me sleep. No, I don't know who she is. No, I don't know how she got in. No, nothing was stolen. Nothing was damaged. She didn't touch me or threaten me. She just stood there and smiled and ran away. The dispatcher was polite but clearly skeptical, and the officers who arrived an hour later took my statement with expressions that suggested they'd heard stranger things, but not by much. They checked the locks, which showed no signs of tampering. They checked the windows, which were all secure. They found no evidence of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been in my apartment except me. "You sure you weren't dreaming?" one of the officers asked, not unkindly. Stress can do funny things to your sleep. I've had nights where I could have sworn someone was in the room with me, and it was just my brain playing tricks. I wanted to argue, wanted to insist that I knew the difference between dreams and reality. But what was the point? I had no proof, no security cameras, no witnesses, nothing except my own terrified certainty that what I'd seen was real. The officers left their card and told me to call if anything else happened. And I locked the door behind them and sat on my couch until the sun came up, watching the shadows retreat and wondering if I was losing my mind. The next day, I called a locksmith and had every lock in the apartment replaced. The guy who came out was thorough, installing new deadbolts and reinforced strike plates and one of those chain locks that would let me open the door a few inches without letting anyone push through. He didn't ask why I wanted the extra security, just did the work and took my money and left me with a ring of shiny new keys that should have made me feel safe. They didn't. Because when I got home from work that night and walked through my newly secured apartment, I found a drinking glass on the kitchen counter. It was one of mine, from the cabinet above the sink, and it was half full of water. I hadn't left it there. I never left dishes out, one of those compulsive habits I'd developed living alone. A way of maintaining control over my small domain. Someone had been in my apartment while I was at work. Someone had let themselves in, poured a glass of water, and left it sitting on my counter like a message. I'm still here. The locks don't matter. I checked every room, every closet, every space large enough to hide a human body. Nothing. I checked the windows again, the locks, the door, all secure, all exactly as I'd left them that morning. There was no way in. There was no explanation. And yet the glass sat there on my counter, condensation beating on its sides, undeniable proof that I wasn't alone. Mrs. Castellano. The thought came to me like a key sliding into a lock, obvious in retrospect. She was the landlord. She had access to everything, probably had copies of every key ever made for this building. I hadn't considered her before because she seemed so harmless, this soft-spoken woman in her 60s who collected my rent in cash and asked about my day whenever we passed on the stairs. But she lived directly below me. She would know when I was home and when I wasn't. She would have heard me moving around at night, would have known my schedule, would have had every opportunity to let herself in while I slept. I went downstairs and knocked on her door. Not sure what I was going to say, but needing to see her face when I said it. She answered after a long moment, peering up at me through glasses that made her eyes look owlish and too large. "Is everything all right, dear? You look pale." "Someone's been coming into my apartment," I said, watching her reaction carefully. "At night, while I'm sleeping. I saw her 3 nights ago. She ran out when I turned on the light." Mrs. Castellano's face went through several expressions in quick succession. Confusion, concern, and something else I couldn't quite identify. She stepped back from the doorway, one hand fluttering to her chest. "That's terrible. Just terrible. Did you call the police?" They didn't find anything. No signs of forced entry. I paused, then pushed forward. Do you have spare keys to my unit? Has anyone else ever had access? Her face changed again, settling into something more guarded. I have a master key, of course, for emergencies, but I've never used it, never let anyone else use it. You're the only tenant I have right now. The other units have been empty for months. She hesitated, and I saw that unidentifiable expression flicker across her features again. What did she look like? The woman you saw? I described her as best I could. Dark hair, pale skin, thin build, that smile that had seemed almost pleased to be discovered. As I spoke, Mrs. Castellanos' face drained of color, her hand gripping the doorframe like she needed it to stay upright. That's not possible, she whispered. That's not. She's been gone for almost a year. Who's been gone? But Mrs. Castellano was shaking her head, backing away from me into her apartment. I can't. I'm sorry. I can't talk about this. You should go. You should leave the building entirely. Find somewhere else to live. She was closing the door now, her eyes wet with something that looked like fear. Please, before it's too late. The door shut in my face, and I heard the deadbolt slide home with a heavy click. I stood there in the dim hallway, my heart racing, her words echoing in my head. She's been gone for almost a year. Before it's too late, I should have taken her advice. I should have packed a bag that night and never looked back. But I didn't understand yet what I was dealing with. Didn't realize that the woman who stood at the foot of my bed wasn't finished with me, that she was just getting started, and that Mrs. Castellano knew exactly who she was and what she wanted. I went back upstairs to my apartment with its useless new locks, and I waited for the night to come. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with every light on and a kitchen knife on the cushion beside me, watching the bedroom doorway like something might emerge from it at any moment. Nothing did. The hours crawled past in silence, broken only by the radiator clicking and the occasional car passing on the street below. And when dawn finally crept through the bay window, I felt hollowed out, scraped raw by exhaustion and fear. But I also felt determined. Mrs. Castellano knew something, and I wasn't going to let her cryptic warning be the end of the conversation. I waited until mid-morning, giving her time to wake up and settle into her day, then went back downstairs and knocked on her door. She didn't answer at first. I could see the shadow of her feet in the gap beneath the door, could hear her breathing on the other side. But I kept knocking until finally the deadbolt slid back and she opened it a crack, the chain still engaged. I need to know who she is, I said. I'm not leaving until you tell me. Mrs. Castellanos' eyes were red-rimmed, like she'd been crying. She studied me for a long moment, then sighed and unhooked the chain. Come in then, but I warned you, some things are better left alone. Her apartment was the mirror image of mine, same layout, but decorated in a style that felt frozen in time, doilies on every surface, faded photographs in ornate frames, the smell of lavender and something mustier underneath. She led me to a small sitting room off the kitchen and gestured for me to take a seat on a velvet couch that had probably been new when Nixon was president. Her name is Margot, Mrs. Castellano said, settling into an armchair across from me. My granddaughter. She lived in your apartment for almost 3 years before. She stopped, her hands twisting in her lap. Before everything went wrong. What happened to her? The old woman was quiet for a long time, staring at a photograph on the mantel that I now recognized as the same dark-haired woman I'd seen standing beside my bed. Younger in the photo, smiling in a way that looked genuine, but unmistakably her. Margot was always troubled, Mrs. Castellano said finally. Even as a child, there was something not quite right. She'd fixate on things, on people, couldn't let go even when she should have. Her parents tried doctors, medications, hospitals. Nothing helped for long. When she turned 18, they gave up, washed their hands of her. I was the only one who didn't. She drew a shaky breath. I let her live here, in the unit upstairs, rent-free, no questions asked. I thought if I gave her stability, gave her a place where she felt safe. Maybe she'd get better. And for a while, she did. She got a job, made a few friends, seemed almost normal. Her voice cracked. Then she met Daniel. Who's Daniel? A man she became obsessed with, a tenant in the building next door. She could see into his apartment from her bedroom window. She started watching him, following him, learning everything about his life. When he noticed and confronted her, she didn't understand why he was upset. In her mind, they were already in a relationship. She just needed to help him see it too. The words echoed something I'd heard before, something from the news or a podcast or one of those true crime shows I used to watch without ever imagining I'd end up living the plot. What did she do to him? Mrs. Castellano closed her eyes. She broke into his apartment while he was sleeping, multiple times. She'd stand by his bed and watch him for hours, just like... She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Daniel called the police, got a restraining order, eventually moved away. But Margot didn't stop. She found his new address, followed him there, broke in again. He woke up and she... A long pause. She had a knife. She said later she wasn't going to hurt him, that she just wanted him to listen, but he didn't know that. He fought back, and in the struggle she fell down the stairs, broke her neck. I sat there in silence, trying to process what I was hearing. The woman who'd been watching me sleep was dead. Had been dead for almost a year, according to Mrs. Castellano. But I'd seen her, not a shadow, not a hallucination, a real person with real feet that made the stairs creak when she ran. That's not possible, I said. I saw her. She was real. She was solid. She ran out of my apartment and I heard her on the stairs. Mrs. Castellano looked at me with something that might have been pity. I know what you saw. I've seen her too sometimes in the hallways at night. I thought I was losing my mind at first, thought the grief was making me imagine things. But then other things started happening. Objects moved, doors opened. That feeling of being watched even when you're alone. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. Margot didn't leave when she died. She came back here, to the only place she ever felt safe. And she's still doing what she always did. Fixating, watching, waiting for someone to love her back. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to tell her that ghosts weren't real, that there had to be a rational explanation, that dead women didn't stand at the foot of your bed and smile at you in the dark. But I'd seen what I'd seen. I'd heard what I'd heard, and the terror in Mrs. Castellano's eyes was too genuine to be performance. Why did you rent the apartment to me? I asked. If you knew she was still here, why let anyone move in? Because I thought she was gone. Tears were streaming down the old woman's face now, cutting tracks through her powder. After Daniel, after she died, there was nothing for months. No signs, no sightings, nothing. I thought maybe she'd finally moved on, found whatever peace she was looking for. I needed the money, needed someone in the building to help cover the bills, and you seemed so... She stopped. You reminded me of Daniel. Same build, same coloring, same way of carrying yourself. I should have realized. I should have known she'd see it too. I stood up so fast, the velvet couch skidded backward on the hardwood floor. You used me as bait. You knew what she was, and you put me right in front of her. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know she was still here. Mrs. Castellano was sobbing now, her whole body shaking. I thought it was over. I thought she was finally at rest. I left without another word, taking the stairs two at a time, my mind racing through options I didn't have. A ghost. I was being stalked by a ghost, by the spirit of a woman who died doing exactly what she was doing to me now. Watching, waiting, fixating on someone who would never love her back. There was no lock that could keep her out, no restraining order that applied to the dead, no rational solution to an irrational problem. But as I reached my apartment door, I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice. It was standing open, just a few inches, just enough to show the darkness beyond. and from somewhere inside, I heard a sound that might have been a floorboard creaking under weight, or might have been nothing at all. She was waiting for me. She'd been waiting this whole time, and now that she knew I knew the truth, I had a feeling the watching was about to become something else entirely. I should have run. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to turn around, go back downstairs, get out of the building, and never come back. But something pulled me forward. That same compulsion that makes you look at a car accident. That morbid need to see the thing you're afraid of instead of just imagining it. I pushed the door open the rest of the way and stepped inside. The apartment was cold, much colder than it should have been with the radiator running. My breath plumed in front of my face as I moved through the living room, checking corners and shadows, my hand gripping the knife I'd kept with me since the night before. The kitchen was empty. The bathroom was empty, which left only the bedroom, where the door stood half open, and a faint sound drifted out, something rhythmic, almost musical, like humming. I pushed the bedroom door open with my foot, staying back, ready to run if anything came at me. The room looked normal at first glance. Bed unmade the way I'd left it, curtains drawn against the daylight, clothes draped over the chair in the corner. Then I saw what was on the bed, and the knife nearly slipped from my fingers. Photographs, dozens of them, spread across the mattress in careful rows, all of them pictures of me. Me at the coffee shop near my office, me walking to my car after work, me sleeping in this very bed, my face slack and vulnerable, captured from an angle that could only have come from someone standing right beside me. They were printed on regular paper, slightly blurry like they'd been taken with a phone camera, and some of them had writing on the back, dates, times, notes in a cramped feminine hand that made my skin crawl. He looks peaceful when he sleeps. Stayed for 2 hours tonight. He never woke up. I think he's starting to feel me. He turned toward me in his sleep, like he knew I was there. The humming had stopped. I looked up from the photographs and she was there, standing in the corner of the room where the shadows were deepest, watching me with those dark eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. She wasn't a silhouette anymore. I could see her clearly now, thin and pale, her dark hair hanging lank around a face that might have been beautiful once but had gone hollow and strange. She was wearing a white nightgown, the fabric stained and torn at the hem, and her feet were bare against the hardwood floor. "You talked to her," Margot said, and her voice was soft, almost childlike. "My grandmother. She told you about me." I backed toward the door, keeping the knife between us. "Stay away from me. I'm calling the police." "The police can't help you." She took a step forward, and the floorboard creaked under her weight. Real weight, solid weight, the sound of something physical moving through space. "No one can help you. We're meant to be together. I knew at the moment I saw you, the way you carried yourself, the way you looked out the window like you were waiting for something. You're just like Daniel, except this time." Her lips curved into that terrible smile. "This time, I won't make the same mistakes." "You're dead," I said, and my voice came out strangled, barely audible. "Mrs. Castellano told me. You died almost a year ago." Margot tilted her head, that same curious gesture I'd seen when she was just a shadow at the foot of my bed. Did I? It didn't feel like dying. It felt like waking up. She took another step, and I matched it with a step backward, my shoulder blades hitting the doorframe. I was so confused at first. I couldn't understand why no one could see me, why grandmother looked right through me like I wasn't there. But then you moved in, and you could see me. You saw me from the very first night, even when I tried to hide in the dark. That's how I knew. Knew what? That you were the one. Her eyes were shining now, wet with tears that seemed to glow in the dim light. Daniel never saw me, not really. He saw a problem, a threat, something to be afraid of. But you've been looking for me ever since that first night. Researching, investigating, trying to understand. You want to know me, and I want to know you too. I want to know everything. She lunged, I threw myself sideways, out of the bedroom and into the hallway, my feet slipping on the hardwood as I scrambled for the front door. I heard her behind me, not running but walking, that same measured pace, like she knew I couldn't escape, like this was just another game she'd already won. The front door was still open from when I'd come in, and I hurled myself through it onto the landing, grabbing the railing to keep from tumbling down the stairs. And then I stopped, because standing at the bottom of the staircase, blocking my only exit, was Mrs. Castellano. She had something in her hands, a length of rope, coiled neatly, and her expression wasn't the grief-stricken guilt I'd seen in her apartment. It was something colder, more resigned, the face of someone who'd made a decision they couldn't take back. "I'm sorry," she said, and her voice was steady now, no trace of tears. "I really am. But she's my granddaughter. She's all I have left." I understood then, with a clarity that felt like ice water in my veins. Mrs. Castellano hadn't just failed to warn me about Margot. She'd chosen me, selected me specifically because I looked like Daniel, because she knew what would happen, because she hoped that giving Margot what she wanted would finally bring her peace. I wasn't a tenant. I was a sacrifice. "She's dead," I said again, but the words felt hollow now, meaningless. "Whatever she is, she's not your granddaughter anymore. She's still my blood." Mrs. Castellano took a step up the stairs, and I heard Margot's footsteps behind me, closing in from both directions. And she's been so lonely since Daniel, so lost. You can help her if you just give her a chance. You can make her happy. I looked back and forth between them, the old woman with her rope and her desperate eyes, the dead girl with her stained nightgown and her hungry smile. There was nowhere to go. The stairs led down to Mrs. Castellano. The apartment led back to Margot. The landing was a dead end, the only other option a window that opened onto a 2-story drop to the courtyard below. 2 stories, maybe survivable, maybe not. I didn't think. I just moved, spinning toward the window, slamming my elbow through the glass, feeling it shatter around me in a cascade of pain and cold air. I heard Mrs. Castellano shout, heard Margot scream something that might have been my name, and then I was through, falling, the world spinning around me as the ground rushed up to meet me. I landed wrong, felt something crack in my ankle, felt the air slam out of my lungs as I hit the concrete of the courtyard. But I was outside, I was free, and I could still move, could still drag myself toward the alley that led to the street, toward lights and people and the world of the living that suddenly felt very far away. Behind me, framed in the broken window 2 stories up, Margot watched me go. She wasn't smiling anymore. She looked confused, almost hurt, like a child who'd been promised a gift and then had it taken away. "I'll find you," she called down, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "You can't hide from me. No one can hide from someone who really loves them." I crawled until I couldn't anymore, and then someone found me, a neighbor walking their dog, a stranger who called 911 and waited with me until the ambulance arrived. The whole time, I could feel her watching from somewhere I couldn't see. The whole time, I knew she was right. This wasn't over. It was never going to be over. The hospital kept me for 3 days. A fractured ankle, 2 cracked ribs, and more stitches than I wanted to count from the glass I'd thrown myself through. The police came to take my statement, and I told them everything except the parts they'd never believe. I said Mrs. Castellano had an accomplice, a woman who'd been stalking me, that they'd worked together to trap me in the apartment. I said I'd jumped from the window to escape, which was true enough. I didn't mention that the accomplice had been dead for almost a year. They arrested Mrs. Castellano the same day. She didn't resist, didn't deny anything, just sat in the back of the patrol car with that same resigned expression she'd worn on the stairs. The detectives told me later that she'd confessed to everything, to selecting me as a tenant because I looked like Daniel, to giving Margot access to my apartment through the master key, to planning something she called a union that would finally bring her granddaughter peace. She spoke about Margot in the present tense, they said. Insisted that her granddaughter was still alive, still living in the building, still waiting for the right person to love her. The psychiatric evaluation deemed her unfit to stand trial. She's in a facility now, somewhere upstate, and I'm told she spends most of her days staring out the window and talking to someone no one else can see. The building was condemned 6 weeks after my escape. The official reason was structural issues. The foundation had been compromised, the inspectors said, by decades of water damage and neglect. But I knew the real reason, even if no one would admit it. The other units had been empty for months because no one could stay there. Tenants would move in and move out within weeks, complaining of cold spots and strange noises and the feeling of being watched. The building had a reputation in the neighborhood, I learned later, had been known for years as a place where bad things happened to people who stayed too long. Mrs. Castellano had hidden that from me, along with everything else. I watched them demolish it from across the street, 3 months after I'd jumped from that window. The wrecking ball swung through the Victorian facade like it was made of paper, sending up clouds of dust and debris that drifted across the quiet street. I told myself I was there for closure, to see the place destroyed, to convince myself that with the building gone, maybe Margot would finally be gone too. I was wrong. I saw her in the dust cloud, just for a moment, a darker shape against the gray, standing motionless in what had been the second-floor landing, watching me watch the destruction of her home. Then the next swing of the wrecking ball passed through her, and she was gone, and I stood there shaking on the sidewalk while strangers walked past without noticing that anything was wrong. I moved across the country after that. Different city, different state, as far from that Victorian building as I could get without leaving the continent. I found an apartment in a modern high-rise with no history, no character, nothing but clean lines and anonymous walls, and neighbors who kept to themselves. I told myself it was a fresh start, a chance to leave everything behind and rebuild a life that didn't include dead women standing at the foot of my bed. For a while, it almost worked. Months went by without incident. No shadows in the corners, no feeling of being watched, no photographs appearing in places they shouldn't be. I started sleeping through the night again, started going to therapy, started cautiously believing that maybe geography mattered to ghosts, that maybe Margot was tied to the building and had been destroyed along with it. Then I woke up one night and she was there. Same position, same stillness, same silhouette at the foot of my bed, darker than the darkness around it, watching me with eyes I couldn't see but could feel. I didn't scream this time, didn't move, didn't speak, just lay there staring back at her while my heart tried to pound its way out of my chest. She stayed longer than she ever had before, long enough for me to understand that running hadn't saved me, that nothing was going to save me, that I was hers now, in a way I couldn't escape. When she finally disappeared, there was a photograph on my pillow. Me, sleeping in my new apartment, in my new city, 3,000 miles from anywhere she should have been able to find me. On the back, in that familiar cramped handwriting, were 3 words that made my blood turn to ice. Always with you. That was 8 months ago. She comes almost every night now, though not always at the foot of the bed. Sometimes she's in the corner, sometimes by the window. Once I found her sitting in the chair across from my bed like she'd been waiting for me to wake up. She never speaks anymore, never tries to touch me, just watches with that patient intensity that I've come to recognize as something like love. Her version of love, anyway. The kind that doesn't need consent, doesn't accept rejection, doesn't understand that some things can't be forced, no matter how badly you want them. I've learned to live with it. That sounds insane, I know. Learning to live with a ghost who watches you sleep, who follows you across the country, who leaves photographs on your pillow to remind you that she's always there. But what choice do I have? I can't exorcise her. I've tried, hired a priest and a medium and a woman who claimed to specialize in spiritual removals, and none of it made any difference. Margot isn't a demon or a lost soul or any of the things those people know how to deal with. She's just a woman who wanted something she couldn't have, and death didn't change that. Death just made it permanent. My therapist says I'm coping remarkably well, considering. She doesn't know the full truth, I've told her I have recurring nightmares about being watched, which is close enough. But she says my anxiety levels have actually decreased over the past few months, that I seem more at peace with my situation than when we first started sessions. I don't know if that's healthy or not. I don't know if accepting the unacceptable is a sign of healing or a sign that something inside me has finally broken. What I know is this. Every night when I close my eyes, Margot is there. And every morning when I wake up, she's gone. Back to wherever ghosts go when the sun rises, waiting for darkness to bring her back to me. It's not a life I would have chosen. It's not a life anyone would choose. But it's the life I have now, and the only way through it is forward. Some nights, when I'm feeling particularly tired or particularly lonely, I find myself talking to her. Nothing important, just the small details of my day, the things I used to tell friends or family before I pushed everyone away. She never responds, never moves, but I like to think she's listening. I like to think that somewhere in whatever's left of her mind, she understands that this is all she's ever going to get from me. Tolerance. Coexistence. The closest thing to acceptance that I can offer someone who refuses to let me go. If you're reading this, maybe you've experienced something similar. Maybe you've woken up to find someone watching you from the darkness, someone who shouldn't be there, someone who refuses to leave no matter how many times you beg them to. If so, I'm sorry. I'm sorry because I don't have any advice for you, don't have any solutions, don't have anything except the cold comfort of knowing you're not alone. Some loves don't die when the lover does. Some obsessions outlast the body that housed them. And some silhouettes at the foot of your bed aren't hallucinations at all. They're just patient, very, very patient, and they have all the time in the world to wait.